By a taste of darkness for Rias, desperate to escape her looming betrothal, Issei's assassination was a convenient opportunity to make him a part of her peerage. But what if that was Issei's plan as well? Wake up and hide your women, the world of supernatural, as the dragon of domination is here. Strong and smart, but still perverted Issei. Issei X Multi. Chapter 1. Rias was acutely aware of the tendril of guilt, worming itself into her heart as she watched the poor perverted boy, walking around with his date. His face was alight with excitement, contrasting with Rias' expression. Not surprising, as he didn't know his date was a supernatural being in disguise, or that she was leading him deeper into the park just to have a more convenient spot for his assassination. Rias was burning with a desire to erase that arrogant fallen angel from the face of the earth. The sheer gall she had, thinking that she could just stroll in the middle of her territory and assassinate a sacred gearholder, one Rias had marked as a future member of her peerage. Power of destruction was crackling on her fingertips, begging to be unleashed. Normally, Rias wouldn't have waited a second before lashing out, burning that arrogant crow into cinders, but the circumstances held her hand. She was desperate enough to allow the assassination of an innocent boy for her own benefit. If only she didn't have that damnable betrothal hanging on her head, threatening to bound her to a pathetic man for eternity. It wasn't that she would be happy with the idea of an arranged marriage even if her betrothed was a nice man. The idea of being married just for politics was anathema to her romantic perception. But the fact that her betrothed was a pig brought her situation to a point of desperation. She was willing to do almost everything to get free of her engagement. She had no intention of living the rest of her life as a spineless man's conquest. But canceling her betrothal was no simple issue. Without her family's support, her options were limited. Her parents were the biggest supporter of the marriage, and while her brother was against it, ironically, his position as the strongest devil prevented him from weighing in an inter-family matter without raising the question of favoritism. There were some political ploys she had employed, and small victories she accumulated, but she had no illusion about how it would end. A rating game, a naked contest of power and strategy between her and her betrothed. And unfortunately, that was the biggest problem. He might be a pathetic man in terms of personality, but Riser Phoenix was the rising star of the rating games. With his full peerage, he had managed to accumulate a string of victories in the short time he had joined the competition. He had just 2 losses in more than a dozen battles he had been through, and even those 2 were more of a thorn on her side rather than beacons of hope. Riser had forfeited those 2 for political favors. Favors that he had no complication employing against her, destroying most of the political capital Rias managed to accumulate. While neither Riser nor her family could object to a rating game as the final arbiter, that would be only comforting if Rias had a reasonable chance for victory. And, as much as it hurt her pride to admit, in her current state, her chances against him was practically nil. She had the vaunted power of destruction, but she wasn't her brother. She couldn't single-handedly win against a full peerage. She didn't even know whether she could win against Riser himself in a fair match-up, with his regeneration ability perfectly countering hers. Her peerage was not ready for such a battle despite their powerful abilities and their unparalleled loyalty. She only had 4 pieces compared to Riser's 15, and to make things even worse, her bishop was still unable to control his power, making her situation even worse. No matter how unique her peerage members were, they wouldn't be able to stand against the opposition. The solution was simple. She needed to recruit. But simple wasn't the same as easy. The most logical front of recruitment, the underground, was effectively barred for her, with Riser using his family's considerable political power and his status as a rising star to hamper her recruitment effort. Her family was stronger than Riser's, but that meant nothing when her parents were actively supporting the marriage, and happy with Riser's attempts. Her only option was to recruit from the human world. Normally, that would be an amazing opportunity, as she was fascinated by the human world and their incredible ability for growth. Some humans were strong enough to win against the devils even without any extraordinary enhancements. With the boost they would receive from the evil pieces, they could be the key for her victory. But once again, Rias was restricted, this time by the strict conditions for her presence on Earth. She was not allowed to step outside Kuo, significantly limiting her pool of candidates. Some of the citizens had amazing potential, as Sona proved with her own peerage, collected from students with no previous combat experience, but showing amazing progress. Rias was sure that, with the growth they were showing, Sona's peerage was going to be a deadly force in the arena in a decade or 2. Nothing more than a blink. But Rias didn't have a decade. She wasn't sure whether she even had a year, with both her family and Riser trying to push the fated day even closer. Expanding her peerage was her biggest priority, enough to make her betray her principles, making her watch helplessly as a student under her protection was about to be assassinated. His unknown but potentially powerful sacred gear should have been immaterial, but this time, fear for her future managed to beat her principles. She let it happen because she couldn't risk him rejecting her offer, no matter how small the chances. But if he was already dead, he had no choice, and Rias could swoop in as the savior. But all that reasoning didn't make it any easier to watch as the fallen angel stabbed him while laughing mercilessly, stretching his death for the sole purpose of insulting him. It was a struggle for her to keep control, not just stepping forward to erase that smug bitch from the face of the earth. Only after the fallen angel had disappeared Rias started walking towards the bloodied body that was lying on the ground, struggling to breathe. Rias hadn't wasted any time before conjuring her pawns, knowing it would be harder to resurrect him if he was actually dead. She placed a pawn on his body and then reached to her power, focused through her kingpiece, trying to activate the ritual. It didn't work, not that Rias was surprised about it. She still didn't know which sacred gear he was holding, but it was strong enough to be noticed even its sealed state. One pawn would never be enough to turn him into a devil unless it was her brother that was resurrecting. She quickly added several more until 5 pawns were resting on his chest, repeating the trigger, but no reaction. She placed the 6th one, her heart beating in excitement. There were very few sacred gears that would resist resurrection by her 6 pawns, especially the holder was just a boy with no training and no magical potential. She added the 7th. Still no reaction. She could feel her palms getting sweaty, with fear joining her excitement as she reached for her last pawn. The doubt assaulted her mind. Maybe she wasn't strong enough. Maybe she deserved to be sold into a marriage like a cattle. When she placed the 8th pawn, it was the confirmation of all of her fears. They stayed inert, failing to react, no matter how many times she tried to trigger the ritual. Rias closed her eyes, trying to stand on her feet in the rush of a sudden vertigo, tears pricking her eyes. She just complicity allowed a student under her protection to be murdered, and it was turned out to be nothing. She was too weak to resurrect him. Maybe it was a divine punishment, nothing less than she deserved. With her eyes closed, she hadn't seen how, but she was distracted by a sudden rush of energy, like a point-blank shout to her magical senses. Her eyes popped open, only to see her pawns burning bright with a deep crimson light, brighter than any other piece Rias had seen. Why, she didn't know. Maybe it was some kind of weird result of using all 8 pawns, or maybe it was her desperation unlocking their full capability. But Rias didn't care about the reason. All that mattered was her pawns disappearing into his body, transforming his flesh to supernatural kind. Rias didn't waste any time before creating a teleportation circle, carrying the poor boy to his own bed, giving him the opportunity for a comfortable rest. One more spell, and he was changed into his pajamas, his blood cleaned. Rias let him sleep, wanting to give him a couple of days to adapt before talking with him about the changes in his life. It would also give the pieces the opportunity to settle into his body. While she teleported to her room, her mind was already busy about how to greet him. He was a famous pervert. Maybe she should step out of the shower to greet him. He certainly deserved a treat like that, after the choice she had forced on him. And tantalizing the idea of sexual reward would no doubt incentives a famous pervert like him. Distracted with her plans, she failed to notice that Issei Hyodo lay with his eyes open, watching her disappear with an amused smirk on his lips. And that's another stage of the plan, completed without a hitch, partner, Issei thought as he watched the red-haired beauty disappear in a rush of crimson light. Despite his desires, he was limiting himself to watch the sway of the spectacular hips that was in front of him. Meanwhile, an alien sensation was spreading to his body, transforming it irrevocably. A plan that I hate. Rose, the voice of an ancient dragon rose from Issei's soul. Or more accurately, from a container right next to his soul, where it was imprisoned. An inescapable prison called sacred gear. We shouldn't be bothering with all those subterfuge. We are the Security. Nothing can stand against us. We should. Really. Even Ophis, said Issei, cutting Ddraig's tirade halfway. We have talked about it hundreds of times, buddy. No matter how hard I work, the limitations of a human body are too hard to suppress. Even against the Albion's wielder, I'm not willing to bet on my chances before a decade of training, and I'm known for betting on some really long shots. Not if you use the Juggernaut drive, Ddraig tried to say, only for Issei to cut him halfway. And like I said before, I have no intention of sacrificing my life just that you can win another point in your eternal grudge match. Like we agreed before, I will make sure to make us strong enough to stand against those threats, but you need to ignore your blind pride for a few months. If only we had time. With all the inventive methods you have developed, it wouldn't take long before your own power was enough to beat that brat carrying Albion's pathetic leeching power. Issei sighed tiredly. I would have preferred that as well, but we simply don't have time. Chaos Brigade starting to act out, they will find us sooner or later. And I'm not willing to take my chances against that asshole Cao Cao again without stacking the deck. The first time was enough. And even if could somehow win against him, there is still Ophis to consider. No, integrating ourselves to one of the major factions is our best bet. Devil's body will give me the edge I need, while the name Grimoire would be enough to shield me until I'm strong enough. After all, dear Lucifer would never allow harm coming on his precious sister. Enough talk. I'm bored, Ddraig said before cutting off the connection, but Issei smirked, knowing that his partner was too distracted by modifying transformation activities going on his body to continue talking. He could feel the foreign energies in his body multiplying again and again, accelerating the maturity of his devil form by decades. The energy provided by the pawns supposed to be just an anchor for the energies a low-class devil would collect through contracts. But the boosted gear was not a simple toy, allowing him to bypass all those steps instead. Still, it was just pure luck that the plan worked. Issei had expected Rias to be strong enough to convert him into the devil, and when it failed, he had to rely on his boosting ability to make up the difference, an untested plan with a significant possibility of failure. He wouldn't die of course, as he could have easily used his powers to boost his regenerative capabilities instead, but it would still ruin the plan. If Grimoire would have witnessed him curing himself, it would have blown the cover he had been using for the last year. After all, it would be difficult to explain to Rias why the pathetic pervert of the school was suddenly able to use his sacred gear for a delicate healing operation. He shrugged as he threw himself into his bed. It all worked well, and there was no need to worry anymore. Sleep would be nice. Tomorrow, he had a lot of things to do. As he left the school after a full day of class, Issei could feel the marvelous increase of strength in his body. But somehow, it wasn't enough to prevent him from feeling annoyed. The reason, a small, but obviously magical, bat following him. He suppressed his desire to squash it with a blast of energy, no matter how annoying was its presence, preventing him from testing his new abilities. It carried the magical signature of Rias, his new king. He didn't want to start the relationship by killing a familiar of hers. The logic of his inaction wasn't enough to cure his annoyance. Even casting a small obstruction spell to get away was not an option, as it would reveal not only he knew that he was being followed, but was also he was magically competent enough to cast a spell. And that would ruin his cover story. A pointless risk at this stage. But soon, he felt another signature of energy closing to his location, an unappetizing mixture of light and darkness. A male fallen angel, he realized, his hand itching to punch through its chest. He had a little grudge for their kind he needed to detach, and his gender made it even more convenient. He never liked hurting females, especially sexy ones like the one responsible for his bogus assassination. He would still punish her for her daring of course, but he had more inventive ways for that. The fallen angel's presence was convenient. He could easily ensure the familiar meeting its end in stray fire. Fallen angels were not the most conservative when it came to throwing their toy flashlights around. He changed his direction towards the fallen angel, trying to continue his role until he started throwing his spears around. But his annoyance jumped up to a new level when the fallen angel, instead of trying to kill him, launched a rather lengthy monologue about his supposed superiority and just in how many ways Issei resembled a cockroach. Issei wanted nothing more than to use rusty needles to teach the arrogant asshole the error of his ways. No matter he was a dragon in his soul, and had a low threshold against insults, but the presence of the familiar bound his hand. Then, a flare of teleportation magic popped in his senses, ruining the opportunity completely. Only then, the fallen angel attacked Issei, realizing he had lost his opportunity. Fucking lazy vulture, Issei murmured, trying to make it convincing as he tried to jump away from the light spear, only to fail. With Rias present, retaliating, or even dodging well, was not an option. He lay on the ground in a fake display of agony while Rias and the fallen angel had a heated argument. The spear hurt more than it did the day before, his new devil body not playing well with its weakness to the light element, but still, it was little more than a momentary distraction. He ignored Ddraig's shouts of annoyance, demanding him to rip the wings of the fallen angel for his insolence. It was hard to resist since it was the exact thing Issei wanted. Thankfully, the fallen angel chose to retreat rather than to battle. A wise choice on the surface, as Rias was the stronger of the pair. Not so much in reality, as it gave Issei the opportunity to track him later on, and extract his retribution. "Oh my poor pawn," Rias murmured in an obvious concern as she looked at his bleeding body. Issei barely held back a snort, amused by her display of concern, as just yesterday, she did nothing to prevent his assassination. "Let's get you cured," said Rias. Issei didn't answer as he felt a pair of soft arms wrapping around before the world disappeared into a crimson flare. When the light subsided, they were back in his room, which surprised Issei a bit. He would have expected her to bring him to a healer instead. But the mystery was resolved when she quickly removed all of her clothing, his clothes subjected to the same treatment a moment later. It took a considerable amount of willpower to keep himself from just pushing her down and teach why it was a bad idea to tease an unfamiliar man. The facade he had been using in the school, the pathetic pervert, was only half fake. He was a pervert indeed, just not pathetic. He was more than capable of seducing a woman or three into his bed whenever he desired. He only stopped it during the last few months to maintain his cover. And that same fact was making things more difficult under the circumstances. His backed-up desires, multiplied by his transformation, was begging him to take Rias. The soft touch of her skin against his wasn't making control any easier. Her purpose was clear, she was using skin contact to maximize energy transfer. It would not only heal him, but would also speed up the settling of the pawn pieces into his body. A poor replica of the trick Ddraig used. Issei knew that it was a risky procedure for a normal reincarnated piece, carrying a significant risk of side effects. But clearly, Rias was desperate enough to risk it. Luckily, risks hadn't applied to Issei. Ddraig had already used his boosting capabilities to mature his devil body, and Rias' procedure amounted to nothing more than a light snack. He still added it to the list of things he would make her pay, of course. Even better, he decided to start right now. Continuing to act like he was asleep, he brought his hands on Rias' spectacular chest, and his fingers sank into its soft expanse without a warning. Rias tried to jump away, startled, but he hooked his leg, accidentally, preventing her from doing so. With his eyes closed, he wasn't able to see her expression, but the way she stiffened was clue enough. She was considering the merits of teleporting away, but the same desperation that made him target her at the first place prevented her from running away. For her, speeding up his development was too important, not to mention he wasn't fully healed. Her uncomfortable deliberation took almost a minute, but in the end, she uncomfortably settled in his embrace, her skin feeling even hotter to touch, cluing him to the fact that, if he had opened his eyes, he would see a blush deep enough to match her hair. He smirked. The night was shaping to be fun. Author notes, "Hello everyone. I know it's not the best practice to put a new story with the others still begging for an update, but this idea was torturing me for the last 2 months, begging to be released. Today is the day I surrender. I hope it was enjoyable." Ch1 of 16. Next, Chapter 2. Issei was lying on his bed, struggling to suppress his body's natural response for a soft, curvy body that was wrapped tightly around his own. And the fact that it had been months since he had experienced the touch of a woman in an effort to maintain his cover wasn't making things any easier. His instincts were begging him to cut loose, to teach the red-headed beauty a lesson she wouldn't forget. Unfortunately, that wasn't an option. He wasn't even allowed to get an erection because of the slowly closing wound on his stomach. Not because it was a difficult wound. On the contrary, it was trivial, at a point that he needed to actually concentrate to prevent it from healing instantly. But unfortunately, the body of the student Issei wouldn't have reacted like that, leaving him to battle with his own instincts. And it was thoroughly uncomfortable. But at least, it was well worth the reward, keeping his new king unaware. His new king, who was currently in his bed without a stitch of clothing, her body pressing against his as she tried to fill his body with her unholy energies in an attempt to bypass months of slow work, a process that would have risked catastrophic side effects on a regular newly minted devil. Issei was far from regular, of course, but it was the thought that counted. From her perspective, she was risking his life once more just to speed up his progress. There was no way that he was going to let it slide without making her pay. The fact that he wasn't under any real danger thanks to a similar but much more effective treatment from his dragonic partner was immaterial. All it mattered that in her mind, she was risking to transform him into a monster just to get away from a wedding arrangement. Issei had done a lot more for lesser offenses. Still, it was ironic that the ritual she was using gave him an excellent opportunity to punish her. For the quickened maturity ritual, there were 3 requirements. Uninterrupted, skin-to-skin physical contact between parties was the first, to the point that even frilly underwear like Rias seemed to prefer would reduce the chances of success. Secondly, the energies needed to be pure, meaning no active spells on either party, not even a rope spell to keep his hands tied. And 3, it required absolute emotional stability in the part of the recipient, hence the reason to do it in his sleep. Issei buried his head on her breasts in an attempt to hide his smirk, and enjoying the beautiful expanse of her bosom as a spectacular side benefit. She stiffened at the unasked physical contact, but otherwise hadn't reacted, her options neatly blocked by the requirements of her ritual. She wasn't allowed to pull back, and she wasn't allowed to cast a spell to paralyze him. Even trying to push his head away was not an option, as in her mind, it risked waking him up, and she couldn't expect an antisocial pervert not to react hysterically if he found himself in the bed with a sexy redhead. All accounted for one important fact. He had unrestricted access to her body for the next few hours. And he was going to abuse the opportunity to the limit. First few minutes passed without action, with his head buried between her breasts, his breath tickling the soft skin of her breasts. Technically, he could have just let his shaft to jump into life and shoved it inside her, but it was pathetically uninspired. There would be no sense of accomplishment if he took her virginity that cheaply. No, he was going to conquer this arrogant beauty who thought she could dominate him, a dragon. He was going to painstakingly teach her until she understood the real balance of power between them. And as a part of it, he wanted her begging before he took her virginity, the perfect way to underline his domination. It took almost 20 minutes for his wound to close, leaving only an ugly red welt behind, marking the point where he would start for real. First, he shifted around like he was trying to find a more comfortable spot, throwing one of his arms on her waist on the process, the other still around her breast, squeezing occasionally in a movement that might be mistaken for sleep twitching. Rias shuffled a bit, but otherwise didn't react. It seemed that the last few minutes where he spent buried in her breasts had desensitized her against small moves like those. Finally, it was time to stop suppressing his most obvious reaction. With his control loosened, his shaft started to grow. He cracked his eyelid slightly, enough to catch a blurred sight of her face, not wanting to miss that momentous occasion. His shaft continued growing. Soon, it was pressing against her stomach. For a moment, confusion dominated her face, but then, she realized the exact nature of the object that was pressing against her body. Her mouth fell open in shock, looking adorable enough to tempt Issei to catch a kiss. But he held back, like her virginity. He wanted her first kiss to be surrendered willingly, or at least, taken forcefully in a situation that left no doubt about the power difference between them. Stealing it like a thief had no appeal for him. And it wasn't like he didn't have other things to be amused. His shaft continued to grow, and with it, her expression of shock. He licked his lips as a delicious panic spread on Ria's face while she comprehended the size of the appendage that was currently pressing against her body. He used the opportunity to sink his fingers deeper into her chest, trusting her to miss its significance in her distracted state. Just as he expected, she did miss it, in a way that managed to surprise him even. One of her hands squeezed through the small gap between their bodies, her fingers tracing his shaft from bottom to top, a disbelieving expression on her face, somehow cute and sexy at the same time. And, much to his surprise, she hadn't pulled her hand back after the first round, choosing to reverse its journey instead. Rias continued to repeat the motion, her shock draining with each repeat, replaced with a lusty curiosity. From her hesitancy, he was sure that it was the first time she was seeing a real one. Once again, he didn't do anything else for a few minutes, letting Rias to get used to the changes in the situation. Then, his hand sneaked to her back, his fingers tracing her spine, copying the movement of her fingers. A small yelp of panic escaped her mouth as she noticed the movement along her spine, her own finger stalling in shock. He stopped as well, trying to give the impression that his movement was just an unconscious attempt to copy hers. She came to the same conclusion a moment later, testing it by sliding her finger just a bit, which Issei copied. "I shouldn't," she murmured in an attempt to convince herself, however reluctantly. She even managed to follow her own recommendation for a full minute. Without the necessity to keep their bodies connected, she might even succeed in her task. But soon, her curiosity proved stronger than her determination, and her finger was back on Issei's shaft, dancing across its length. He didn't lose any time before replicating her rhythm on her spine, caressing her skin in a slow but steady manner. On the third pass, he decided to spice things up a little, and increased the pressure on her spine, unexpected pressure making her arc her back attractively, which enhanced her generous chest deliciously. He would have liked to use his teeth to pin her flailing breasts in place, but that would have ruined the scheme he put in place. But the temptation wasn't going to be denied completely. When Rias smashed her chest against his in a hurry, trying to maximize the contact once more, he used the opportunity to slide his finger further until his fingertip was resting at the beginning of her bottom. She failed to notice, her attention occupied by creating a mental copy of a particular appendage pressing against her stomach. Slowly, an attractive mixture of mischievous curiosity dominated her face, and the dance of her fingers quickened. For Issei, keeping back a laugh was a real challenge. The situation was comically ironic. There was a red-headed devil in his bed caressing his shaft, completely naked, yet somehow, she was a virgin that lacked even the slightest experience, owing to her overprotective family. And him, the supposed virgin boy that she supposed to taint, was playing her like a fiddle. And to make things even funnier, she was supposed to be his king, his ultimate ruler. Too bad for her, she was going to become his toy in less than a month. A part of him was begging him to start the process right now, turning her to his devoted slave by the dawn, but that was too risky. He didn't think she could act good enough to avoid suspicion, especially from her fellow king, Sona Citri. From there, it would only take a concerned message to one of the Satans, and all of his efforts would have come tumbling down. Issei couldn't help but squeeze her breast hard enough to extract a moan from Rias' lips the moment he remembered Sona, who managed to earn his ire successfully despite their extremely limited contact. The way she talked to him always rubbed him wrong, like he was nothing more than an uppity dog who dared to talk back to royalty. Of course, she was going to get her just desserts. He even knew the best way of penetrating her shell. The same thing she was most proud of. Chess. But tonight was not about Sona, Issei decided as he squeezed Rias' breast once more, trying to maximize the sensation he received from the moment. This time, Rias didn't react other than letting out a small moan, meaning she was starting to write off his molestations as a part of his sleep pattern. Issei had no qualms with abusing the opportunity created by her faulty assumptions. He started squeezing her breasts repeatedly, altering his pressure and rhythm slightly with each repeat to maximize the pleasure. Meanwhile, his other hand, which was caressing her back, quickened its dance along her spine, awakening a tremble across her body. And even more importantly, the dance of her finger over his shaft quickened, following his rhythm perfectly. Pushing forward was tempting, but Issei chose to keep the pace. An hour passed in the same pattern, broken only by occasional adjustments of speed, of which Rias always followed a moment later. She was subconsciously following his rhythm, which was a huge win. Normally, the balance between the pawn and king pieces would have enforced otherwise. A detail a more experienced devil would doubtlessly notice. But Rias was just a young woman, deeply distracted by her own desires and guilt, to notice a detail like that. In other words, perfect virgin sacrifice for the dragon that was named Issei. But as the hour progressed, so did Issei's desires. He decided to push the envelope even further despite the risks. He allowed his hand, which was meticulously caressing her back for the last hour, to slide lower, cupping her plump ass. His fingers sank into her tight flesh, spry enough to bounce a coin. The sudden change of pace caught Rias in surprise, and a moan, louder than the previous ones, escaped her mouth, echoing on the walls. She tried to pull back, but his other hand was ready to prevent it. It held on her shoulder in a steel grip, preventing her from pulling back. He loosened the grip a moment later, enough that she could pull back if she wanted, but the delay was enough for her to remember the necessity of connection. As far as she knew, she needed to maintain the physical connection if she wanted to have a strong pawn, no matter what. If it wasn't for his desire to take her virginity only after she begged him desperately, he would have slid inside her, testing whether her resolution of having a strong pawn was enough to offset the loss of her virginity. With that avenue closed, he needed something else to tease her. Why not jealousy, he decided in a moment of enlightenment. Rias clearly thought herself as the most popular person in the school, an impression that was further reinforced by the abject worship from the student body and her own peerage. And such an impression created a fragile ego, making jealousy the best tool to puncture it, especially in the compromising position they were sharing. But coming up with the best name to arouse her jealousy was the challenge. The humans were automatically out, as despite her attempts to embrace the human culture, Rias was still a devil and didn't treat humans as worthy of her consideration. For devils, even the best of them, Ordinary humans were little more than well-trained pets, cute and impressive, maybe, but definitely not worthy of their jealousy. Rias would never take a human name seriously, which only left the devils in the school as a candidate. For a moment, Issei considered Sona, a fellow king of the same social class. If her new pawn was dreaming her rival, she would doubtlessly be annoyed, he thought. Then, he got an even better idea. He didn't lose any time before employing it, because he could sense the energy flow between their bodies slowing down, signifying the closing end to their intimacy. He squeezed her body harder than before, one hand on her breast, the other palming her hips. Her body arched under the sudden rush of feeling, but then, he opened his mouth. "Oh, Akeno," he moaned, and just like that, she froze in his arms. It took quite a bit for Issei to keep himself from laughing out loud after seeing her expression, contorted with shock. Of course, he continued pushing. He leaned to capture her nipple between his lips, sucking greedily. That managed to pull her out of her frozen state. She pressed her hand on his shoulder and pushed him back. He chose not to resist, but grabbed her nipple between his teeth at the last second, the resulting pull enough to extract a cry of her. "Oh, Akeno-chan, so wild," he murmured, still acting like he was asleep. Filled with a jealous outrage, Rias had pulled her hand back, leaving his shaft bereft of her attention. But their bodies were still connected together as she tried to maintain the spell to enhance his abilities, unaware that it was a complete waste of time. But the energy flow between them suddenly quickened, which would make the procedure riskier than necessary if it had been actually working, but apparently for her, the sting on her pride was more important than the safety of her pawn, her ticket to freedom. Nice to know, Issei noted. Knowing the lengths she would go for her pride would be useful in his journey to break her. But as the procedure neared completion, Issei couldn't help but throw one last dig towards her. "Akeno-chan. Why do your breasts feel so small? They were supposed to be bigger, and perkier," he added, and was rewarded by a furious gasp, followed by a push that broke the contact between them. Once again, Issei focused not to laugh as Rias jumped out of the bed, gathering her clothes as she mumbled angrily. From the occasional jealous glances he caught, Issei knew that Rias was jealous of Akeno's slightly bigger breasts, but he didn't expect her to react badly enough to terminate the process early. Only after the naked figure of Rias disappeared in a shower of crimson light, holding her school uniform against her chest, Issei started laughing. Training his new king was going to be fun. Issei wasn't surprised when Kiba stepped inside the classroom the moment the last bell of the day rang. After all, as far as Rias knew, Issei was still unaware of the supernatural world, chalking up his encounters to bad dreams. He just nodded as Kiba invited him for a talk in the occult club, and followed him without saying a word, ignoring the panic it created in the females of the school, loudly verbalizing their fears about him infecting Kiba with his perversion. Issei didn't pay much attention to them. The other students were nothing more than the background, their only value was to allow him to stay camouflaged. Their opinions worth nothing, especially in a silly topic like that. Soon, they cut through the gardens and stepped inside the occult club, a huge building, especially since it was just a clubhouse. It was smaller than the actual school by a decent margin, but made up the difference by the expensiveness of the decor. Just with a glance, Issei was able to identify many precious relics of underworld, enough to fetch quite a payoff in the black market. However, Issei was in a place that could derive no benefit from material wealth, so he let them be. And more importantly, if he could complete the first leg of his plan, he was going to access more resources than he could imagine. Kiba stood in front of a door which was more ornate than the others and knocked, pulling Issei out of his thoughts. The door opened, revealing the second most popular girl of the school, Akeno Himejima, on the other side of the door. "Thanks, Kiba-kun," she said. Kiba just nodded before walking away. "Why don't you come in, Issei-kun? We have a lot to talk about." What exactly, Issei started to say before a sudden stop. He felt his eyes widen in shock. The reason? There was a shower in the middle of the room, surrounded by a curtain that was too thin to hide its insides. And more importantly, the shower was occupied by a familiar figure. He wasn't expecting Rias to be that daring. His genuine shock lasted only for a second, but Issei continued the charade, making a show of stumbling towards the nearest chair, only to miss it, his eyes firmly on the silhouette on the shower curtain while his face twisted into the astonished expression of a perverted virgin. And holding that expression was hard, especially since all he wanted to do was to laugh mockingly as Rias continued her shower behind the insufficient coverage of the curtain. Or more accurately, she swayed under the hot water in a way that reminded him of a stripper. He smiled victoriously. It was clear it was her way of revenge for the last night, teasing him by something that he couldn't actually reach. He couldn't wait to show her just how mistaken she was in that belief. But that was no reason to miss the show that was going in front of him. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, watching Rias' enchanting sway as she was surrounded by a hot cloud of steam, her assets bouncing freely. From the corner of his eye, he could see Akeno watching them with a smile on her lips, but there was a tenseness that she tried to hide. Issei was willing to bet that she wasn't happy with her king debasing herself to impress upon. And he was willing to go forward even more, and betting that Rias didn't explain that she was doing that only because he was murmuring Akeno's name in his sleep. Things were going to go even easier than his plans, he realized, if manipulating his new king was that easy. Just a stab to her vanity, a clouded challenge to her self-worth, and she would hurry to counterattack, doing the exact thing Issei wanted her to do. Akeno, could you pass the towel, please, Rias said as she turned off the water. Akeno didn't neglect to send a sultry, if a bit artificial, smile towards Issei as she stepped behind the curtain, her shadow joining Rias. But instead of passing the towel to Rias, she started drying her, occasional giggles suggesting ticklishness. Issei had to admit, their plan was simple but effective. It was unfortunate that it was based on faulty information. It would have worked splendidly if he was the simpering weakling he presented himself to be. Then, Rias stepped out of the cover, wearing nothing other than a thin towel, clinging to her body excellently with its slight dampness. But more importantly, on her back, there were a pair of bat wings, proudly on display. Issei-kun, we need to talk, she said, a sly smile adorning her face. Author notes. Issei starts working on his new king. The first step on her harsh, debasing, but ultimately very enjoyable lesson. Also, don't forget to check my original writings in Patreon, Ddraig_Gray. Previous ch2 of 16 next L Chapter 3, wow, Rias-senpai, you're so sexy, Issei said with an exaggerated shocked tone which fit his fake persona excellently as he examined Rias, who was wearing nothing but a towel that clung to her body in a way that left little to the imagination, with her wings open proudly behind her. I didn't know you were into cosplay, but you definitely came to the right person to ask for help, he continued excitedly, amused by the way Rias' superior expression slid into disappointment as she failed to get the shock she was clearly aiming for. And it didn't help when Akeno giggled in amusement. Issei-kun, Rias answered, trying to hide her disappointment. It's not cosplay. It's not? Issei asked, his voice dejected. So the props are for something boring, like theater. I'll still help, of course, but I would have, he tried to contain until Rias took a step forward and pressed her finger on his lips, her frustration only intensifying as Akeno giggled once more, even louder this time. Would you mind? Rias said as she turned her gaze at Akeno for a moment. Sorry, bucko, Akeno said in a tone that implied that she wasn't slightest bit sorry. Rias turned back to Issei, doing her best to regain her composure, but it was a difficult task. Clearly, she had been hoping that her combined display with the wings and the revealing state of her body would shock him appropriately, giving her a dominant opening position. It's not cosplay, Issei-kun, she said. They are real. Is this a joke? Issei stammered, trying to put a convincing display. Then, he continued like he was speaking to himself. Or maybe it's another dream. Lately, I had a few dreams where random people sprouted wings and attacked me. Maybe this is one of them. He took a step back, pushing an expression of nervousness on his face. You're not going to attack me as well, right, senpai? He asked with a trembling voice. Trembling, because he was having trouble suppressing his laughter at the frustrated expression on Ria's face. Clearly, fear was not what she was expecting. No, Issei-kun, she said as patient and kind as she could manage. I'm not going to attack you. But maybe you should sit down, what I'm about to tell is going to be hard to handle. He decided to give her a break, and sat on the couch, not that it was a huge sacrifice, especially since Rias sat across him, her short towel riding up to give him a glimpse of her treasure. There is no easy way of saying that, so I'm just going to plow through. We are devils, Rias said while Akeno stood next to her, unleashing her own wings. This time, Issei followed it with more serious questions while acting suitably shocked, and Rias launched a rather long explanation about the supernatural world, about devils, angels, and the battle between three factions. As she explained, Akeno took a step back, fading into the background. Or trying to, as it was hard to do for a sexy girl like that, but at least, she tried. I see, Issei murmured after Rias finished her explanation several minutes later. But there is one thing I don't understand. Why are you telling me this? It's about Yuma, Rias said, trying to sound shocked and regretful. Your date with her was not a dream, not even the last part where she started flying and tried to kill you with a spear made of light. Issei noted that as she was explaining the last section, her towel was slowly sliding down, exposing the delicious-looking skin of her breasts bit by bit. Smart, Issei thought. By aligning the most critical part of his supposed origin story with her wardrobe malfunction, she was assuming that a pervert like him wouldn't have asked difficult questions like how Rias was lucky enough to arrive in a window between his death and the deadline for his resurrection. But everyone else claimed that it never happened, Issei countered. How can it be anything other than a dream? A basic memory manipulation spell from the fallen angel was all it took to erase the evidence, she explained. But that's not important. I noticed her presence in my territory too late, and unfortunately, when I arrived, you were already dead. Dead, Issei repeated, trying to sound as shocked as Rias expected him to be. But I'm not dead. I can resurrect the dead as a devil, provided it's just a few minutes after their demise, Rias explained. And I did that to you, she followed. Her towel slid away from her body in that exact moment, giving Issei an unrestricted view of her breasts. Perfectly timed, Issei admitted. If he had been the pathetic pervert he was playing to be, he would have already forgotten the most important parts of the discussion. So, I'm a devil, Issei stammered as he watched Rias wrapping the towel around her chest once more, smug with the way she managed to keep his attention on her body. That would not do, Issei decided, and turned his gaze to slid towards Akino's attractively crossed legs, making sure to be obvious enough to be caught by Rias. Jackpot, he thought when he saw a flash of jealousy on Rias' face. Akino's satisfaction was just a bonus. He knew that Akino's satisfaction was entirely about pulling one over Rias rather than about himself, but he didn't let it bother him. He had a lot of time to change that particular fact. Yes, Issei-kun, Rias answered calmly. You must have noticed some differences in your body, weakness to sunlight, increased strength, keener senses. Like a superhero, Issei cut in. Exactly, Rias added. We're like superheroes. Of course, it's a society with its own rules and requirements, Rias continued, following that with another lengthy explanation of basics of the peerage system, his role, different devil classes, and other peripheral information. Issei reacted with an appropriate level of cheer when Rias revealed that as a devil, he would be allowed to have his own harem once he managed to reach high-class status. She finished her explanation with a breakdown on sacred gears. So, those fallen angels tried to kill me because of my sacred gear, right? Issei said. What does mine can do? We don't know yet, Rias answered, a sliver of worry slivering into her voice despite her struggle to sound calm. Issei knew the reason for her worry. She knew that his sacred gear was a strong one, given that she had to use all of her pawns to actually resurrect him, but not all strong sacred gears had equal combat application, especially when it came to highly restricted events like raiding games. There were some strong gears that could empower the whole armies, but were completely useless in squad level. Is there a way to test? Issei asked, faking enthusiasm. If I have something strong, it would be much easier for me to actually get a harem of my own, he added. Then, he turned to Akino. Maybe I can even steal you for my own harem, Akino-chan, he said with a smirk. Maybe, Akino said with a fake laugh, trying not to seem like she thought him as a cockroach. He couldn't wait to teach her the error of her ways. Anyway, Rias said, cutting Akino off. Issei struggled to suppress his smirk, amused by the ease he could manipulate Rias. It was clear that she was doing her best to use her sexual appeal to tie him to her peerage, but his attention to Akino was starting to sting her pride visibly. We should focus on you trying to conjure your sacred gear. With all those fallen angels around, you need a weapon to protect yourself. But how? Issei said as he raised his arm. Try to focus on your own body. A sacred gear is part of your soul, and it should answer to your need. Issei put a show of struggling for a while, but then sighed in disappointment. It's not working, he said dejectedly. Try again, Issei-kun, Rias insisted. It's very important for your safety. If you have access to it, you can defend yourself even in an ambush, at least for a while before reinforcements can arrive. I'm trying, but it's not working, Issei said after another display of struggle. Maybe we're approaching it from a wrong direction, Akino suddenly said even as she reached for the top button of her shirt, unlocking it with an elegant twist of her fingers. Issei-kun is a devil, and like all devils, he is driven by his sins. She unbuttoned a second one, revealing the beginnings of a cleavage. And I could have a good guess about Issei-kun's sin. What do you think, bucko? I guess, Rias admitted. Issei sent a questioning look, continuing to play his idiot role. 7 sins, Rias explained. Pride, wrath, gluttony, sloth, greed, envy, and then there is yours, lust, Rias said. Definitely, Issei shouted with an exaggerated display. He was sure that his sin was pride, something that was further exacerbated by Ddraig's effect on his early development, but the primary sin for his alter ego was obviously lust. So, maybe we should give Issei a little push through his passions, Akeno whispered seductively as she continued to unlock her buttons, revealing a black, lacy bra that was struggling to hold back her amazing breasts. What do you think, Issei? Akeno gasped exaggeratedly. Would you like to sink your fingers on my hot breasts? All it would take is to conjure your sacred gear, and then you can test their softness. Really, Issei said, ignoring the way Rias was discreetly letting her towel to slide down. Rias wasn't happy to be ignored. Rias cut him off immediately. Akeno, that's enough. You don't need to put yourself into that position. As a king, it's something I need to do. Issei's smirk went unnoticed as Akeno turned towards her king with a shocked expression, failing to understand Rias' overreaction. Despite all that talk about the sins, she failed to realize Rias was being led astray by them, her envy and pride in particular, which was triggered by her perceived loss of last night. Issei understood where her anger was coming from. At this point in her life, one thing Rias wanted more than anything in her life was control over her life, but she didn't have it. Her absolute control over her peerage was the closest she could reach, and she wasn't willing to let it go. Having a peerage member that she didn't control was unacceptable, even if he was controlled by her queen. Issei smirked. If it was that easy to manipulate her, maybe training his new king would be even easier than he first thought. If you wish so, bucko, Akeno said as she buttoned her shirt once more. Rias just nodded, ignoring the worry in Akeno's tone. Akeno opened her mouth to say anything else, but Rias just shook her head, sending a warning glare towards Akeno. It was a harsher one than the situation deserved, and Akeno looked a bit hurt, but still followed her king's command, and left the room. So, Rias-senpai, Issei started, but Rias cut him off. Please call me bucko, she said, but as Issei's attention turned towards her cleavage, a blush spread through her face, as if it was only occurring to her that what she had committed for. Clearly, it was a rash decision she regretted, but with Akeno already out, there was little she could do to change. Even declaring that she changed her mind was not an option for her, as she was in a hurry to convince Issei about her trustworthiness, and changing her mind that easily would work against that aim. She raised her hand, and a ray of red energy reached for the door, locking it with a distinct click. While she couldn't avoid it, she could at least ensure that there would be no observers. Let's move on the couch, Rias said, pointing towards the rather bulky seat on the corner of the room. Issei took a seat on the couch, deliberately seating closer to the middle to force Rias to stay closer. How are we going to do it? Issei asked. Should I just, he said before reaching forward, deliberately leaving the sentence dangling, but the grabbing motion with his hand was enough to fill the blanks. I guess, Rias murmured, for once her haughtiness nowhere to be seen. Issei understood the reason perfectly. His earlier research showed that, for all her bluster, she was a complete novice when it came to touch of a male. From her reaction, it might be that her experience might be limited to blind fumbles of the last night. And since she didn't know about his trick, from her perspective, it was the first time a man was about to touch her consciously, and to make things even worse, he was directly going for the second base. Oh pie, Issei murmured, doing his best to look overwhelmed by the opportunity. He made sure that the smile that appeared on his face as he leaned forward was more perverted than victorious. He gently put his hand under her breasts, the area that was still covered by her towel, then closed his eyes. It helps, he murmured. I can sense something in my right arm, something strong, something potent. As he spoke, he sank his fingers to her breasts, the thin towel barely putting a barrier in between. Very good, Issei-kun, Rias said. Issei examined her expression discreetly. She tried to seem enthusiastic, but her acting abilities weren't good enough to erase her distaste completely. Now, try to bring that feeling forward. I'm trying, but it's tough. The sensation is slipping away. He opened his eyes and stopped squeezing for a moment, giving the impression of deep thought. Maybe this would help, he said with obvious excitement, and pulled Rias' towel down. It pooled on her waist, leaving her chest bereft of protection. She gasped as his fingers sank into her flesh once more, this time without her towel to reduce the impact. She was shocked by his daring, but from her expression, he could see that she was about to push him away, but he exactly knew how to prevent it. It's working, Rias murmured in disbelief, her eyes focused on Issei's right arm, which was bathed with a crimson shine, creating the silhouette of a gauntlet. Not one to miss such an opportunity, Issei started squeezing her peaks harder. A few seconds, she let it be, and when she opened her mouth to complain, he intensified the light on his arm, giving her another evidence that it was working excellently. Then, he grabbed her nipple with his shining hand, and twisted, forcing a gasp from her. Issei, she started to say, but he chose that point to materialize his sacred gear, and her words died on her lips. That's my sacred gear, Issei murmured as he squeezed her nipple between his metal-clad fingers. Neat, it still has the sensation of touch. A twice critical, Rias murmured in shock, examining Issei's arm, which was covered with the sealed version of the boosted gear. I don't understand, how can it be a twice critical? It took all of my pawns. Issei didn't want her to slide into despair, so he cut her off. Bucko, I don't know how, but I can still feel that something is locked in my arm. Something vast and angry. It's hard to describe, but I'm convinced that it's only a small part of its full potential. A sealed form, of course, Rias answered, her shock replaced with excitement. Of course. She repeated as she jumped on her feet in excitement, her impressive tits tangling attractively. Even better, her towel slid down even further, revealing her womanhood to Issei's gaze. Nice, Issei moaned in a faux shock. Rias yelped in shock as she tried to reach for the towel, realizing that, in her excitement, she accidentally provided a true feast for his eyes. Issei let his gauntlet to shine once more, suggesting that seeing her naked was helping him to break through the lock. Rias pulled the towel on in a hurry, and the glow stopped, but he left the twice critical out, mostly to convince Rias that her sacrifice wasn't in vain. With physical evidence of her success, she would be more easily convinced for future experimentation. I think that's enough for today, Rias stammered as she clutched on her towel. It seemed that her accidental flashing him was far above her limits. I think it's better if you dispel your sacred gear for today. It's better if we take it slowly, without overwhelming you. You know the best, bucko, Issei answered as he turned eyes to his gauntlet. A moment of intense concentration later, the gauntlet melted back into his arm, leaving his arm bare. Then, he raised his hands, and wiggled his fingers suggestively, a lecherous smile on his lips. But I'm always up for more experimentation if you're willing to. Try to summon your sacred gear, she asked. He closed his eyes, trying to give an impression of intense focus, but pulled only a few sparks. It's easier than before, but it's still hard, like there is a barrier I can't push through. He turned his eyes to her towel-covered bosom pointedly. Rias didn't say anything for a moment, but Issei continued to look. Okay, she said with a sigh as she let her towel to fall to her waist, her exasperation suggesting that she saw no harm in giving another view of her amazing breasts, but she still kept her womanhood hidden. How about this, Issei-kun, she gasped in a flirty tone. Is this working for you? It's working, Rias-chan, Issei answered as he devoured her sexy body with his eyes, intentionally using her name rather than the title she asked him to use. And a few seconds later, the twice critical was in his arm. Huh, that was much easier, he added. Practice makes it perfect, Issei-kun, Rias said as she reached for her towel once more, but her measured words contrasted with her spreading blush. But I think we should call it a day. It has been a tough day for you, with a lot of developments. Tomorrow, you can start working on your contracts. Whatever you wish, bucko, Issei answered cheerfully. But what should I do if I run into one of these fallen angels? He asked. She nibbled her lips as she considered his words. Good point, there is no guarantee that they won't target you. Maybe you should just stay there. It shouldn't be hard since you live alone. I'll send my familiars to pick your personal items, Rias said. According to the cover he was using, he was an orphan, though, in actuality, he had deposited his parents in a safe location in Australia years ago, with a dash of memory manipulation and a buttload of defensive spells to make it stick. He wasn't the poster boy when it came to familial duties, but even he acknowledged that having a family bustling around when he was one slip up away from the most wanted man in the supernatural world. For a moment, he considered whether to play insulted orphan thing, but then decided against. It might have made sense if he was masquerading as a strong but mysterious boy. In that case, acting like an asshole would only add to his attractiveness, but in his current role, it wouldn't help any. Tell them to be careful about my games. They're very precious, Issei said. I'll do so. For now, you can use the room at the end of the corridor, Rias said, relaxed that her offer accepted quickly. Now, why don't you go and see your new room while I change? As you wish, bucko, he murmured as he walked away. Rias waved her hand and removed the magical lock from the door, and Issei stepped into the corridor. Another transparent ploy from her, Issei thought derisively as he searched for his new room. By making him move out of his house and into her domain for security reasons, she linked him to her logistically without turning it into a confrontation. And it gave her the chance to shower him with luxuries, he added as he stepped in his new room, lavishly decorated, and a huge, four-poster bed in the middle of the room. Issei couldn't wait to break Rias on that exact bed. Author notes. A new king, a new residence, and a new target. Maybe a midnight walk in his new house was not such a bad idea. Who knows what he might find. Also, don't forget to check my original writings in Patreon, Dirk_Gray. First, previous ch3 of 16. Next, chapter 4. Issei was sitting on his bed, trying to fall asleep, but it was proving to be a difficult affair, his mind turning towards his plan with an annoying frequency, feeling constrained by its requirements. He was still in the early stages of it, and he needed to stay relatively passive for the first few months, at least until his new peerage get used to his constant presence, giving him the opportunity to walk around without getting instantly identified as a threat. But his dragonic instincts turned out to be a true inconvenience. He was in an unfamiliar residence with dubious security measures, and his instincts were begging him to secure it with the strongest spells available for him, to conceal it from anyone that might try to leverage his vulnerability. Unfortunately, doing so would reveal his hand prematurely and ruining everything he had been struggling for the last few months. A compromise, he decided as he stood up with a sigh. While he couldn't use his own spells to secure the building, there was no harm for him to patrol it as long as he made sure to stay hidden. Confirming the lack of threat with his own eyes would help him to relax. He took a deep breath as he focused on his magical signature, suppressing it to a degree that would avoid triggering any alarms, then stepped out of his room. The corridor was illuminated by flickering electric lights that strangely felt like torches, creating dancing shadows on the ornately designed walls, decorated opulently. Such a waste, he decided. If he had just a sliver of the riches that were represented in the corridor when he first discovered his sacred gear, things would have developed much easier. The lack of funds had delayed his plans quite a bit in the past when he was still weak, forcing him to focus on acquiring money instead of training. It was a pity that his acute need for money was a thing of the past. His new problems couldn't be solved by swiping a gold-plated lamppost. He still required a lot of resources, but those weren't the kind that could be exchanged for money or gold, locked behind impenetrable walls by the key players. Slivers of it may be bequeathed to distant allies. Luckily, Issei recently moved to a point where he had the ear of one of the most prominent heiresses of the underworld, sister to the Lucifer himself. If all went well, he would soon have preferential access to one of the best vaults in existence. With that in mind, he ignored the rather pricey artifacts on the walls and started walking. He allowed a thin layer of his magic to spread away from his body, allowing him to sense the people through the walls. He could sense Kiba in the nearest room, but he just passed the door without bothering to check the room. Issei could sense that he was alone, and he had no intention on peeking at another dude. There was no one else on the level he was in, but he could sense 3 more upstairs, and a complicated, but very interesting, magical seal on the basement. Most likely Rias' hidden bishop, he decided. During his research, he managed to discover that Rias has a bishop that she was forced to seal because of their powers, but that was the limit of the information he was able to acquire. Despite the temptation, he elected not to go downstairs to check. He wasn't a slouch when it came to warding, but he lacked finesse. His preference was either to bulldoze through them, or sneak inside without disturbing the defensive matrix. Unfortunately, neither of them was a good fit to discover the secrets of her bishop, who was protected by warfare-level wards. But things were different for the wards that stood between the first and the second floor, where Rias, Akano, and Kaniko's bedrooms were. He focused on suppressing his magical presence even more, bringing a feature he liked to call Hunter Mode. With that on, the poorly made alarm ward that separated their bedrooms from the boys proved no barrier. He managed to walk past it without triggering anything. He walked to the upstairs corridor, getting a sense of the room without making it extreme. The nearest room, he could sense Kaniko's presence inside. He carefully reached for the door, doing his best to stay silent as he opened the door.
But the moment he started twisting, he heard a hiss from inside. He had been noticed, he realized. Apparently, her Nekomata senses were even sharper than his assumptions. He pulled back, just as careful, waiting at the corridor a few seconds to make sure she hadn't actually woken up.
Luckily, she kept sleeping, leaving him free to turn to his next target, the sadist queen of lighting, Akano. He hoped that without a racially enhanced hearing, he would have an easier time sneaking into her room. Still, he was careful as he pulled the door open, waiting for a moment to confirm that Akano was deep in sleep before stepping inside. The first thing he noticed was the decor of the room. A traditional Japanese layout, perfect for a traditional daughter who would ask for her parents' permission before sneezing. Weird, he thought. He had been expecting her private space to be decorated more fittingly to her real personality rather than the fake one she used around the school, but maybe tricking the school population wasn't the only reason for her facade. Still, he didn't have much issue in ignoring that particular puzzle while his gaze fell onto the amazing figure of Akano, her spectacular figure hugged tightly by a lacy black nightie.
She looked innocent in her sleep, but Issei had observed her enough to know that it was just an illusion.
She was a true sadist that enjoyed both physical and mental torture, though living amongst the students didn't provide her with many opportunities to indulge other than schoolyard torture. Though, Issei's research showed that she was enthusiastic in using stray devil hunts to discharge her particular desires. The few bodies Issei had examined had been littered with signs of prolonged torture. Such an interesting challenge you are, Akano-chan, Issei murmured in enthusiasm. Just a few days more, he added, trying to rein his dragonic instincts, shouting him to start the process now, but it wasn't hard to suppress them, not with the experience he had on that. Compared to the years he spent on his plan, waiting a few more days until he could break her to rebuild her as a submissive doll was nothing.
The only question was whether to break her first, or after Rias. Both options had their merits. As Rias, queen, Akano was in prime position to assist Rias to maintain her balance through Issei's manipulations. And while Akano amusedly complied with his earlier trick today, it was obvious that she only did it as a prank. Anything more serious, she would have interjected, breaking the ploy.
But there was also a certain poetic justice in leaving her unbroken, but watching as her king slowly lost herself in the arms of her new pawn. Breaking Akano with the help of Rias would be particularly amusing. Regardless, there was no harm starting it today, he decided. Even if he prioritized Rias over Akano, there was no harm in getting some head start. Not to mention it would be a good excuse to test his new magical abilities, expanded thanks to his devil body. He needed some practice if he didn't want to accidentally destroy a building or three.
With that in mind, he closed his eyes, trying to bring forth the whole concept his sacred gear was built upon. Doubling. He couldn't help but think about the closed mindlessness of the previous wielders, treating their abilities as nothing more than a simple power battery.
And as a result, despite the famed potential as a god killer, no wielder actually managed to achieve something worthwhile. Yes, they did destroy a lot of towns, few cities, and the occasional army, but looking back, no wielder actually managed to do something worthwhile with their power. And none of them managed to actually kill a god, their straightforward approach to combat easily countered by beings that had seen innumerable forms of combat. Issei was different. Forced by his mundane background, weak body, and the constant danger he faced, he had been forced to think outside of the box. And in his struggle, he discovered that doubling, the very concept his sacred gear was built upon, was much more flexible than any of the previous wielders had suspected. For them, it was nothing more than a tool to increase their physical power, or impact of their magical attacks.
However, during his years on the run, Issei had learned how to use that concept to manipulate everything around him, changing the battlefield, manipulating his enemies, even enhancing his occasional allies. He even used to change people's mind. Admittedly, it didn't work smoothly when he tried to manipulate something as fleeting as thoughts. It was hard to use in combat situations due to the target's magical resistance, flaring to the maximum under stress, blunting the effect.
And until now, there had been limited applications for non-combat purposes as well. He hadn't been able to use that without materializing his sacred gear to the physical plane, which made impossible use it for mental purposes unless he was out of their sight.
He closed his eyes, trying to reach the core of his power while suppressing its ability to materialize. Something that would have been impossible without the devil pieces inside him, thoroughly enhanced by dragonic power, acting as an alternative conduit. Even with that, Pulling more than a sliver of power was impossible.
But a sliver was more than enough for his purposes. Success! He gasped excitedly when he felt the rush from familiar energy filling his veins without the accompanying weight around his wrist. Then, he remembered where he was, and opened his eyes in panic, afraid he had woken up Akeno. The scene that met his gaze validated his alarm. Akeno was shuffling in her place, like she was about to wake up. Double, he murmured, more reflexively than anything. The spell, unshaped, was halfway leaving his control when he realized that his mistake. Strengthening himself would barely help him in the situation. In a last-ditch effort, he focused on his spell, trying to link the concept of doubling to the ephemeral concept of Akeno's sleepiness. Then he held his breath, waiting. Akeno continued shuffling, making him think that he was about to fail. He started to form an invisibility spell, hoping to hide from her gaze, when he noticed Akeno's movements had ceased, and she was back to sleep once more. He was aware that he was very lucky. Speaking had been a mistake, though not as big as trying to use his sacred gear in a hurry. Casting a regular sleep spell would have been much better, but with his dragonic power already in his hand, his instincts were quicker than his reasoning. Luckily, it somehow worked, saving him from a total disaster. He turned his focus back to Akeno with a relaxed sigh, who was hugging a pillow tightly against her chest, her amazing breasts trying to spill from her negligee. Even while sleeping, she was really sexy. Perfect, Issei murmured, feeling safe enough to speak now that Akeno was under the throes of magically enhanced sleep, a prideful smile on his lip, enjoying his success of using his sacred gear to fuel his spell without a physical manifestation to fuel a relatively complicated spell. That had so many possibilities.
And no time like the present to test them, especially with such a convenient testing dummy. Once again he gathered his dragonic power. The target still the same, so was the spell, but the objective was different. This time, her arousal was on the crosshair.
Akeno started shuffling once more, but this time, it brought satisfaction rather than panic. Since Issei was sure that the spell to keep her asleep would hold, he had no complications about leaning back, enjoying the way her negligee ridden up, revealing her smooth thighs, plump enough to tempt him to take a quick bite, or better, deign the surface with a stiff spank. Much to his disappointment, such a physical involvement was not an option, but luckily, it wasn't the only way Issei could mess with her further. He cast several more spells on her in rapid succession, most of them trying to stroke her arousal further, some to enhance the pleasure she would feel from her own touch, while a few of them slated to make sure she stayed asleep. Then, Issei leaned back, wanting to enjoy the show that was about to start.
The results were lackluster at first, causing her to turn in her bed like she was uncomfortable. But Issei knew better, so kept his position. Soon, Akeno pushed the cover, which was barely covering her body in any case, with an errant kick, providing Issei with the endless expanse of her sinfully delicious legs. The pillow that she was holding against her chest was the next one to go, sent to the floor with a negligent push as she started to warm up.
Issei was very familiar with the signs of arousal, which was increasing every time she twisted and turned, her skin rubbing against the linens of the bed, the sensations enhanced by the spells. After a while, her hands joined the fray, landing on her cleavage, searching for a zipper that didn't exist to reduce the heat. But in their unsuccessful search, they ended up caressing the soft skin of her breasts quite a bit, enhancing her arousal even more, enough to force a gasp through her ruby lips. But it was just a bite of appetizer in a true feast, Issei realized soon after when she started to search more pleasure. Her hands slid lower a bit, which easily pushed the chest section of her nightwear down, giving Issei a view of her spectacular breasts. Issei could feel his mouth watering at the sight, and his pants getting tighter. Soon, her fingers found her nipples, caressing them softly, forcing beautiful gasps off her lips.
He felt disappointed for a moment when one of her hands slid away, but it left its place to excitement when her hands landed on her legs, slowly dragging down her negligee up, teasing even in her sleep. Soon, it was high enough to reveal a very interesting secret. Apparently, Akeno preferred to sleep without panties. He shifted the position of his chair a bit, trying to get a better view of the more interesting part of the show, just in time to see her fingers clamp around her clit, every repeat bringing another dash of pleasure, her moans getting louder and louder. Her other hand sank into the supple flesh of her breasts in an effort to enhance her pleasure further. There was a limit to Issei's patience, and it was coming very quickly. He decided to take a few precautions to prevent a disaster first, casting an alarm spell to alert him if someone comes near. The second thing he focused on was his pants, pushing them down to reveal his shaft. It had been getting very uncomfortable in them. And since it was out, there was no harm to wrap his fingers around it for a couple of pumps just to relieve some of the temptations he was feeling. Predictably, it didn't really help, especially when her legs widened open to give him a perfect view, and the way two of her fingers slid inside with a corresponding increase in her moans made the situation even more tempting. Issei wished that she was awake, which would make the situation even better, but unfortunately, it was too early to push to the things to such a level, and he didn't want to do anything more in her unconscious state. It wouldn't have been fun.
With a disappointed sigh, he pulled his pants back on and left the room, leaving Akeno alone in her unconscious masturbation, trying to console himself with the success of his experimentation.
A slight concern about doing a bit much during his evening visit had passed Issei's mind as he took a seat on the breakfast table, which he shared with Rias and Akeno, the latter with a mussed hair and slouched shoulders, clearly short on sleep. Either his spells were rather damaging on her sleep quality, or she had woken up as the effects of the sleep portion disappeared before the arousal part, and found herself battling with raging arousal for no reason.
Did you have a good night's sleep, Akeno-chan? Rias said, clearly concerned. Akeno just shrugged, saying nothing. Maybe you should skip the first 2 classes to get some sleep.
You know how President gets when we skip class, Bushu, Akeno murmured, her eyes on the table, looking exhausted enough to make Issei feel a speck of guilt. Not in an amount to really change his mind about anything, of course, but enough that he took a couple of from the number of spanks he would make her suffer when he finally took the full control of Rias' peerage.
Don't worry about her, Akeno-chan. I'll talk to her, you just go and catch a couple hours of sleep.
Thanks, Bushu, Akeno murmured, then turned to him. See you around Issei-kun, she added, and then left the room, too exhausted to add her trademarked swing to her hips.
So, Rias-san, Issei started, only to be stopped by a glare from Issei. Sorry, bucko, he corrected with a fake apology. Is there anything else I need to be careful around the school? Just try not to anger Sona-chan, Rias said. She will be extra strict on you now that you're a part of my peerage, and it's best if we don't have any reason for conflict. Why, are you guys enemies or something? Issei said, trying to look concerned. Rias waved off his concern with an amused smirk. No, we're firm allies, but sometimes Sona could get a bit strict, and it's best if we don't give her any excuse.
I see, Issei said, focusing on his breakfast, other than occasional appreciative glances he sent towards Rias' chest, lingering just enough to be caught by her, causing her to blush. He had no doubt that, if it wasn't for their earlier encounter, she would doubtlessly enjoy his focus. He kept silent until he finished his breakfast. So, bucko, are we going to have another training session for my sacred gear before the class? Another session. Rias suddenly stammered, making Issei struggle to keep his smirk hidden. For a supposed naturist, she was having too much trouble showing her body. The loss of control must have affected her even worse than Issei had first thought. Isn't it a bit early for that? If you think so, Issei said with an unconcerned voice, it's not like we're in a hurry to increase my power. I have no problem hiding under the wards for a while to avoid those fallen angels, he commented, making an obscure reference to Rias' upcoming engagement, one that he was supposed to be unaware of. Maybe a quick session is not a bad idea, Rias said. Excellent, Issei thought as he stood up, curious how far he would be able to push his so-called master this time. Author notes. Another session with his sexy, red-headed king. Maybe he could convince her for a more hands-on experience. Also, don't forget to check my original writings in Patreon, Dirk_Gray. First, previous ch4 of 16 next, just chapter 5. For a moment, Issei said nothing, preferring to watch as Rias locked the entrance of the room with a couple of spells, far stronger than what was necessary to warn an accidental visitor, revealing the pressure she was in. So, bucko, Issei said with a smirk as he raised his hand. Are you ready to start? Sure. Rias said, trying to sound confident, but the hints of nervousness managed to slip through her control. But why don't you show me what you can do? Seeing how far you can go will give us a baseline for the effectiveness of the training. Her hope was clear, that Issei somehow managed to improve overnight as his body had processed the devil energies that had been provided by the pawns in his body and the dangerous procedure she had applied, enough to make the demeaning process she was about to go through unnecessary. Issei had no intention of allowing an easy escape after sinking his talons,
but giving her some hope would make her impale deeper into the situation in her own volition. Something that Issei aimed to realize literally as well. He pushed a concentrated expression on his face, creating a show from the struggle he was supposed to feel. Then, he partially materialized the twice critical form, bathing the room under a crimson light. "Come on, Issei-kun, you can do it," Rias cheered. He chose that moment to materialize it, though he kept it only for a few flickering seconds. "Not bad," she murmured, failing to hide her disappointment at his lasting power. Issei acted unaware of her mood shifts, and walked towards her until the distance between them was less than a step. But Rias didn't look alarmed until he brought his hand towards her chest. What are you doing?" she stammered, taking a step back. Issei didn't wait to take another step, once again dwindling the distance into nothing. "I'm helping you to prepare, bucko," he said with a smirk. "It's the gentlemanly thing to do." The indecisiveness of Rias' face lasted only until he put his hand on the first button, and a crimson glow covered his hand once more, this time without any display of stress on his face, just to imply that even the excitement of undressing her helped him to push forward. Tempted by the effectiveness of the treatment, Rias nodded resignedly as Issei unbuttoned her shirt, the twice critical form of his sacred gear fully materializing halfway in. He didn't break the stride, and continued unbuttoning her shirt, revealing her bra underneath. Her bra was, without a doubt, magically enhanced, as there was no way that fragile-looking congregation of lace and strings would be able to hold her incredible bosom under control, which was straining against the unfair prison it had been put in. He placed his left hand on the firm yet supple surface of the said bosom, enjoying the sinful sensation it brought, while his right hand continued removing her remaining buttons, and soon, her shirt fell to the side. With her upper body open to his ministrations, his gauntleted hand joined the game, dancing over her smooth stomach, tracing the lines of her body. The expert, measured dance of his fingers over her body didn't exactly fit into his role as the overenthusiastic pervert, but he trusted his luck enough to bet on the fact that Rias wouldn't notice that particular bit of inconsistency. Not when she was starting to get distracted by the said treatment. The first sign of it working was a soft moan, which she converted into a cough hurriedly. The second sign was the removal of her shirt, without requiring a prompt from his side, even. Issei elected not to comment on it, but he used the opportunity to bring his gauntleted hand on her back, gently caressing her spine while leaving a simple, innocent boost, targeting her arousal, though with a delayed effect to avoid suspicion. It was a pleasure to its own to watch Rias as the effect of his magical intervention slowly took hold, further enhancing the arousal she was feeling. And the spell had quite a bit of margin to work on. As for all her bluster, Rias was a virgin devil with a body made literally for sin. Even the most innocent of his touches had found fertile ground in her inexperienced flesh and mind. Though, the real feast started when he sank his fingers deep into the flesh of her breast, and she responded with a loud, needy moan, marking the time to push forward. His fingers found the clasp of her bra, getting rid of it in one lazy flick. Rias didn't comment as her bra ended up discarded on the side, giving him unrestricted access to her mounds. But despite the progress that was dazzling her, Rias was alarmed. Without a warning, he leaned forward and captured one of her erect nipples between his teeth, biting just hard enough to make her flinch. Moving to the uncharted ground managed to pull her out of the haze. "Issei," she started, but he was ready for it. He brought his sacred gear to an angle Rias could see it, and made it glow with a shimmering crimson light, the exact way it looked before he unlocked the sealed form of his gear. The implied promise of discovering the next form of his sacred gear, the promise of potential that made her spend all of her pawns, was turned out to be enough to convince her that a few gentle nibbles on her breasts were harmless, or at least, as harmless as it could be under the circumstances. What was a bit of saliva when compared to a bet for her eventual future? But that wasn't the limit of what Issei wanted to reach today, not even close, so he maintained tight control over the light, making sure its growth plateaued soon after, while he focused on sucking Rias' breasts for several minutes. "Issei-kun," she murmured, trying to speak in her usual haughtiness, but that was a hard mood to maintain with her target latched around her breasts. "Do you think it will take long for you to break it?" "I don't know, bucko," Issei answered with a fake sincerity after he pulled back, though his hands were still on her breasts, squeezing them as he spoke. "It's hard to describe, but I feel like there is a barrier that's preventing me from reaching to its core, and I need something more to break through it." "Something more," Rias repeated, her eyes growing wide in shock with the implications. "Maybe we should continue it later," she added as she reached for her bra. She looked at the clock on the wall with an exaggerated mannerism, which had the added benefit of making her breasts dance gently. The class is about to start. Whatever you wish, bucko, Issei answered as he turned to left the room, though he couldn't help but throw a parting shot at her. It's not like we're in a hurry, after all. With that, he closed the door, leaving a thoughtful Rias behind. It was funny how little being a devil helped against the mind-numbing monotony of the classes, Issei thought as he left the final class of the day, and walked towards his new residence, where his new king awaited, hopefully with a positive answer to the question which he indirectly raised in the morning, about how far she was willing to go to unlock his full power. His initial plan was to make a brief stop in his room to drop his stuff before moving to Rias' room, but things changed when he noticed the subtle ward he had placed around his room was disturbed, meaning that there was an uninvited guest in his room. Probably nothing to worry about, he murmured softly, though he couldn't help but feel nervous. Things would get real complicated real fast if one of his enemies had found his track, but arming himself fully in the middle of the corridor was not an option as well, as bringing his balance breaker or something fancier would probably trigger every single magical detector in the vicinity, ruining his game. In the end, there was nothing to do but take a bit of risk. He was reasonably hopeful that he would be able to tank a surprise assault from a majority of his enemies, and the rest wouldn't deign themselves to hide in his bedroom like that. Still, that didn't prevent him from pushing his door with a certain awareness. He hadn't been expecting the view on the other side of the door, though it was by no means unwelcome. "Hello, Issei-kun," said a soft, kind voice, contrasting the real personality of the owner. "Akeno-chan," he said with an eager smile, letting his awareness to melt for a bit. "To what do I owe your surprising presence?" he continued, even though he could make an educated guess about her presence. It was clear that Rias had balked on the requirements to unlock his sacred gear, and asked her queen to fill for her. Though, while her presence was not surprising, her clothing definitely was. It wasn't the rather revealing cut of her clothing which was barely fit to be called lingerie, even when the fabric stretched desperately to barely cover the essentials. No, he was surprised by the nature of her dress. From what he could gather from her reputation, he expected her to be wearing black and red leather, with at least one whip, possibly more, to complete the vision. Instead, she was wearing a dazzling white lingerie set, complete with stockings, managing to project a perfect mixture of innocence and nervous excitement, like she was an enthusiastic bride waiting for her first night. Her public persona as the prim and proper lady enhanced the impression even further, resulting in a rather abrupt boner on Issei's part. "Well," Akeno murmured as she stood up, somehow managing to jiggle every single curve she had as she did so. Issei pushed the door close while Akeno walked towards him. "Bucko has mentioned that you are having some trouble unsealing your sacred gear," she said as she closed in the distance. When she put her hand on his forearm and leaned forward, which, incidentally, provided Issei with an amazing view of her cleavage, she started speaking once more. "Why don't you show me?" Issei said nothing, just raised his right arm and brought the twice critical on the surface, with a pale crimson glow to indicate the possibilities. Akeno dragged him towards the bed, with a very distinctive sway on her hips, but Issei could easily tell that Akeno's attention was on his sacred gear. "So, you're having trouble getting your sacred gear up," Akeno murmured, though she didn't bother to hints of disdain in her tone, relying on her near nakedness to make him miss the undertone. Admittedly, not a bad assumption, as she had a body that would have distracted him easily if he wasn't extremely alert. When they arrived at the bed, Akeno made him sit, before taking a seat next to him, close enough that their arms were rubbing together. "That's the problem," Issei said, ignoring the dig for the moment, though taking note to make her pay later. "From what Bucko could deduce, it's simply a lack of power, and should be fixed in stages as I develop magically. After examination, she decided that increasing my connection with my sins should enhance my strength," Issei smirked, before continuing with a completely bullshit explanation. "She is such a thoughtful king. I told her that there was no need to suffer just for me, that I wasn't bothered to hide from fallen angel attacks, but she is determined to make me strong enough that I could walk freely, without a worry." Akeno relaxed through his explanation, thinking that Issei had no idea of the real stakes, nor the possible risks of those procedures on a newly resurrected devil. "So, Issei-kun, tell me, what's the sin that you want to focus on? Pride? Or maybe I should order some food so that you can focus on gluttony." Akeno-chan," Issei murmured, faking shyness, even though Akeno's current mode of dress suggested she was fully aware of which sin they were targeting. "Actually, Bucko had a different idea, didn't she mention it to you?" "Maybe," Akeno said as she stretched. "But, be a good boy and remind Akeno-chan what was it, Okay. Issei smiled, ignoring the temptation to launch a much-needed explanation about how to treat her betters, but he had a role to play. He first blushed, fitting to a boy that stayed away from real women while proclaiming his so-called status as some kind of super pervert, then muttered a one-word answer. Lust. Lust. Akeno repeated even as she brought her hand to her lips like she was scandalized by the whole idea. Too exaggerated to be believable, but considering the way she was dressed, subtlety and realism didn't seem to be on her target. What a naughty boy you were, Issei-kun, asking a young maiden like me to debase myself for your entertainment. With a giggle that she somehow managed to make it sound demure and shy, she stood up, and put her hands on his shoulders. You're lucky that Bucko wants you to be as strong as possible before sending you out for the missions, she whispered throatily as she leaned forward, her lips close to his ear, and Issei increased the crimson glow of his sacred gear to imply that her efforts were working as well as she could have hoped for. Though, it was interesting to learn that Rias was planning to send her out despite the fallen angels gunning for him. Maybe she already handled them, but from what he had seen, Rias likely believed that with his powerful sacred gear, a few measly fallen angels wouldn't be a problem for him. A rather horrible assumption, Issei knew. Unless the gear in talk didn't provide constant durability bonuses or instant healing capabilities, it wouldn't negate an ambush, especially on the hands of a devil as weak as he's supposed to be. Rias desperately needed a combat refresher on more irregular side of the battle, it seemed. Her instincts and decision. It was a pity Issei couldn't be the one to deliver that lesson. Not in the next few days, at least. But that was a topic for another day. It wasn't like the Fallen would be able to ambush him, and even if they managed to engineer a situation to force him to combat, he could relax a few restrictions on his power, playing it off as another proof for the effectiveness of Rias' development plan. But it wasn't fair to Akeno to be bothered with such boring details while she was doing her best to make him relax. He turned his attention to her, who was walking towards the desk, where an old-style music player had been placed in his absence. Akeno sent a smirking glare towards him as she raised the needle, then dropped it on the spinning vinyl. When she traversed the distance once more, a sensual beat of the music accompanied her. Come on, Issei-kun, Akeno moaned as she danced with an erotic sway that managed to make his pants uncomfortably tight. Show me just how strong, how manly you are, show me your power. Issei let the glow of his gauntlet intensify, but not enough to suggest that she was on the cusp of victory with just the preview. She sent a disappointed glare towards his gauntlet, clearly unsatisfied by the reaction she had earned, but thankfully, her dedication to her king was stronger than her annoyance. Following the insidious rhythm of the music, she started swaying in front of him. The setup she had created was obviously inspired by a private dance room. Issei wondered the flexibility of the no-touch rule. He reached forward to cup her breasts, but only to receive a small lightning bolt on the back of his hand, one that would have hurt quite a bit if he had been as weak as he played to be. Respect the rules, she said with a smile. It wasn't a gentle smile, with hints of her sadism peeking through. Still, it only added to her sexiness, so he had no complaints. Watching only. Issei repeated with an exaggerated disappointment while giving his best-kicked puppy look. In her eyes, he could see the disregard she felt towards him was intensifying, disgusted with his weakness, which was intentional. Less respect she had towards him, less she would pay attention to his actions. It was important because, unlike Rias, Akeno had a more grounded way of assessing reality, making her marginally harder to manipulate. Luckily, he had plenty of time to teach her. Exactly. Unless you can prove that you deserve more, of course, Akeno added, managing to keep her disinterest away from her voice. She sent a pointed glare towards his gauntlet, hoping that the implied promise would push him enough for a breakthrough. Initially, his intention had been to make Akeno work hard for revealing the achievement, but her boredom was strong enough to make him revise that plan. Since it would be hard to acquire Akeno before he could reveal his real power, why shouldn't he use the opportunity to increase his hold over Rias? Meanwhile, Akeno placed her feet on his erection, tracing his zipper with her toe until she could take a hold of it, then gracefully pulled her foot back, revealing his shaft in the process. She shivered for a moment as the full size of his erection filled her sight, but her poor impression of him allowed her to disregard that, even as her soul started to dance over it up and down, sending a shiver of pleasure to his body. Such an initiative deserved a reward. He let the glow of his sacred gear to intensify even further, and for the first time around one of those devils, let a sliver of power to slip out of control. Akeno's eyes grew in shock as the sensation of power slammed at her, but she hadn't lost her enjoyment, still thinking that Issei was someone she could dominate even with his fully realized sacred gear. But her distraction was the perfect opportunity to manipulate her emotions in a more precise manner. He could have used the opportunity to instill a sense of obedience, but that wouldn't be enjoyable. Instead, using the trick with the boosted gear, he increased her sense of superiority even further, which he hoped would fuel the competition between Akeno and Rias. That's an impressive weapon, Akeno murmured, her voice constricted as Issei let the crimson glow of his weapon disappear, letting Akeno to see his Longinus in its full form. She silently examined it, trying to believe the fact that she was looking at one of the 13 legendary weapons that rumored to be strong enough to kill a god. Issei let her so, partially because, in her shock, her feet continued to dance across his length, giving him the pleasure he required. Is it a strong one? He asked after a minute, ignoring Ddraig's annoyed growl in his mind. You could say so, Akeno said as she stood up. Issei let the boosted gear to disperse, once again acting like he was too weak to maintain it, which also pushed the sense of disappointment back on Akeno's face. Bucko is going to be very happy, she murmured even as she stood up, summoning a black robe with a wave of her hand. Sleep tight, Issei-kun, she said with a smirk as she closed the door behind her, unknowingly earning yet another punishment for her name, to be delivered in a not-too-far future. He dressed down to his boxers, then started waiting, knowing he would have another guest in a few minutes. When a hesitant knock reached his ear, he didn't need to be an oracle to know the identity of his unannounced guest. Author notes. With the reveal of boosted gear, things are about to heat up. My originals are in Patreon, Dirk_Gray, including my new medieval magic school themed gamer FIC. Consider checking it out. And always, reviews are welcome. First, previous ch5 of 16 next. Chapter 6. When Issei invited his surprise guest inside, he wasn't exactly surprised when the said guest had a distinctive crimson hair. I hope I'm not disturbing you, Issei-kun, Rias said with a tone that clearly attempted to be calm and collected, but her excitement was too obvious to hide. She was wearing a skirt-blouse combo that would have been modest on anyone without her supernaturally supple curves, her obvious lack of bra pushing the impact even further. Not at all, bucko, he answered. Nothing that couldn't be delayed for a few minutes, at least, he added, shifting a bit to make it clear he was talking about his raging erection, left unattended by Akeno after her success. I see, Rias said, unable to control her blush, suggesting that her previous exposure failed to create the necessary impact. How can I help you, Rias-chan, he said, sneaking a more familiar way of speaking to leverage the opportunity. Or is it just a social visit? Akeno dropped by to mention that you had a breakthrough on your sacred gear, she mentioned, her excitement laced with annoyance. The reasoning was equally obvious based on the words she stressed. His ploy of annoying her through jealousy seemed to work well. Yeah, Issei said even as he leaned back a bit, which enhanced the pose of his manhood, barely contained by his boxer. It was a fleeting thing, but it felt powerful. What it is exactly? She is not sure, Rias said. It's better if I examine it before we can talk about the details. Can you summon it again? Issei nodded, but once again, rather than materializing it completely, he summoned its sealed state, but with a slight red shine that suggested an unlocked potential. Sorry, bucko. It seems that I'm exhausted a bit. The first time took quite a bit from me. Maybe we can try in the morning instead? It was a very reasonable request. Sweet and understanding on the surface, but he only suggested that because he knew she wouldn't take it. With both Gremory and Fenix families trying to push her wedding closer, before Rias could put together a decent peerage to give her a fighting chance through a raiding game, every day was important to her. Thanks for offering, Issei-kun, but we might try to bring it to surface if you're willing to work through your exhaustion, she said, taking a step forward as she explained, which drove her skirt up in a way magic was definitely involved, high enough to give a hint on the color of her panties before sliding back. A nice view, one that didn't make it a struggle to maintain his pervert role. Being flashed by a sexy devil was not exactly a huge sacrifice. Whatever you wish, bucko, he said. Deciding to leverage their closeness, he grabbed her arm and pulled her on his lap. She yelped in panic. What are you doing? She called, trying to pull away, but his grip didn't allow her to do so. You're going to examine the gear when it appears, so I decided to keep you close, he explained, hiding his smirk taking all of his efforts. But if you can't handle doing as much as Akeno-chan. No, that's okay. Rias answered hurriedly, cutting him before he could even complete his sentence, her attitude transformed completely. Issei smirked, amused by the ease she was being manipulated. Perils of a sheltered life. She was lucky that she had fallen into his trap rather than any other devils, as Issei had no illusion of how cruel and vain that they would have been in his place. If you say so, bucko. I don't want to make you uncomfortable. Of course, that would have been more convincing if he hadn't already pulled her on his lap while he was wearing just boxers, but that worked well. But you need to sit facing towards me if you are willing to completely repeat Akano-chan's effort, he added, telling a small white lie, betting on his assumption that Akano wouldn't go into details. Rias said nothing, just kept her position, trying to decide. A warning was needed, so he reduced the glow of his sacred gear, giving her a wordless reminder of what was needed if she wanted to see the true form of his sacred gear. It managed to break her concerns. She stood up for a moment, and when she sat back on his lap, her legs were parted, her eyes close to his. Her skirt rode upward enough to give a glimpse of her panties. Issei let the glow intensify, suggesting that she was on the right track. Rias opened her mouth, about to say something, but only a yelp escaped her mouth when Issei grabbed her bottom and pulled her closer. It's too much. Rias started to speak as Issei pulled her over his length, his grip strong enough to prevent her squirming. He was using more strength than it should be possible for a newly raised pawn, but he was willing to bet that Rias would miss that particular fact at the excitement of the moment. The reason, he finally allowed the boosted gear to appear in front of Rias' eyes. It's Longinus, Rias murmured in a fascinated voice. I'm so lucky. It was true, but in a direction that she had no idea, but Issei didn't bother to inform her that, not when she was going to learn that the hard way in a couple of months. Do you want me to keep it active, to see how long I could maintain it? Issei said, his tone as clinical as he could manage, trying to make her miss the fact that she was still on his lap, giving a pleasurable treatment to his shaft. That would be useful, Rias said distractedly, paying too much attention to the presence of the Longinus on his hand to actually consider the implications of her permission. Issei was ready to remind her, however. He used his gauntleted hand to grab her blouse and pulled down, harsh enough to rip the magically reinforced fabric. His lips were already around her nipple, giving her an intimate massage when she recovered enough to make a comment, her retreat still cut by his other arm. Issei-kun. She started, but he chose exactly that moment to use a boost to increase the sensitivity of her nipples, timing it perfectly with a bite to her soft flesh. Her words disappeared into a pleasure-filled cry, under the assault of an unexpected rush of pleasure. Something her devil nature left her ill-prepared to resist. He continued licking and teasing while she tried to catch her breath. Issei, she tried to repeat, only to receive the same treatment once more. This time, he pulled away from her glorious breasts. His new king had a lot of faults, but none of them was about her body, a statement that was especially true for her breasts. They were amazing, like they were sculpted by gods, perfectly shaped, with just the right amount of bounciness. Their natural sensitivity was just the icing on the cake. I need your assistance to keep it up, bucko, he said calmly, like he was commenting on the weather. I could already feel slipping away, he added, this time with more urgency, adding a dull red glow to the gauntlet as a warning. That glow convinced Rias to give a subtle, almost non-existent nod, based more on surprise than logic, but it was enough for Issei. His lips clamped around her nipple, continuing her treatment. This time, she didn't moan, but not for a lack of desire to do so. From the corner of his eye, he could see her biting her lips desperately, trying to contain it. He decided to give her a bonus, and presented his gauntleted hand to her, allowing her to examine it. It was good that it didn't block the sensations, because her reverential caress of its crimson surface increased his desire even further, making him imagine these fingers gliding across his length once she learned about the correct power balance in their relationship. It's amazing, Rias murmured in fascination. Enough power to kill a god, hidden behind such a small thing, she murmured. In another position, Issei would have explained the rather exaggerated reputation of the Longinuses as god killers, as, during their history, many owners bought the hype and challenged gods, but only a handful of gods ever fallen, all minor deities, and scores of bearers had fallen in exchange. And boosted gear and divine dividing were particularly infamous on that, usually infecting their wielders with the arrogance of a dragon. But he was an idiot, so rather than spinning a lengthy explanation, he continued, leaving a trail of kisses and bite marks over her breasts. He also slipped his hand underneath her skirt, testing the softness of her derriere to compare against her breasts. The verdict favored the latter, but it was a close call. At that point, he was expecting Rias to call an end. So beautiful, so powerful, Rias murmured instead, fascinated, which made Issei smile. Apparently, the shock of finding out that her randomly acquired pawn had one of the strongest sacred gears in existence, combined with the exhilaration of having the said artifact in such proximity, triggered her greed enough to make her effectively drunk, though his not-so-subtle teasing likely also played a role. He wasn't someone to miss such a beautiful opportunity, of course. His hand was already in a good position, so he pushed her a bit, enough to make her glide along his shaft, giving it the treatment it deserved. She moved her hips automatically, too distracted with the treasure she was holding to understand the significance of the moment. Her distraction worked wonders for his trick, and he started to direct her hips, making her pick up speed. Soon, her instincts took control, as she started rocking her hips, allowing him to focus on tasting the texture of his body instead. Her moans picked up intensity, filling the room. When Issei bit her breast harder, it managed to push her through the edge, and she started twitching on his lap, her arousal seeping through her underwear, dousing his boxers as well. How he wished that. Yes. Yes. Rias moaned as her arms wrapped around his neck, trying to ride her sudden orgasm, her hips dancing wildly. How Issei wished that pushing inside her at that moment was an option, but unfortunately, that would have destroyed his progress, making her too defensive in the following encounters. He had to do with a beautiful redhead, trembling on his lap erotically. Only after Issei let his gauntlet to disappear, Rias realized what she had been doing during the last few minutes. I think we can count it as a successful test, can't we, bucko, Issei said with a smirk. Rias jumped back, which made her naked breasts to jiggle in a way that tempted Issei to extend the encounter. Rias fixed her blouse in a hurry, like an extra second would have mattered after everything they had done. She murmured, trying to come up with something to say. Yes, that was a success, she added rapidly even as she walked towards the door. It's for the best if you rest for the day. You worked hard. I'll talk to you tomorrow, she said with rapid succession, then slammed the door behind her, leaving Issei alone. Issei just lay on his back, enjoying the moment despite his blue balls. Things were progressing nicely. Page Issei leaned back to dodge yet another swing from Kiba before lunging forward with an enhanced burst of speed and punched him in the gut. That's better, Issei-san, Kiba said even as he leaned back, reducing the impact of the punch. You have shown a significant improvement. It was a bit of an empty compliment in Kiba's part, as not only he wasn't using his full speed, but also he limited himself to a simple sword. But the emptiness of the compliment didn't bother Issei. After all, Kiba wasn't the only one that was holding back. The aim of the session was to show some improvement in his capabilities. Enough to convince Rias about his ability to handle missions on his own, while leaving enough need for repeated sessions to increase his raw power further. Strictly speaking, missions weren't a necessity, but staying cooped in a building for weeks didn't appeal to him. Thankfully, as the wielder of the boosted gear, he had a lot of leeway on sudden power spikes, especially with the supplementary training he was receiving from his king to increase his base power. How was it, bucko? Issei shouted as he turned towards the said redhead, who was watching the training from the balcony, like a Roman dictator watching a couple of gladiators, haughty and impervious. Or more accurately, that was the image she was trying to display, which fell apart the moment Issei made eye contact with her, replaced with a blush. It was hard to be impervious with the memories of grinding on the lap of one of the gladiators. Much better, Issei-kun. This time, you managed to hold for almost a minute. How many boosts you were able to maintain? 6. 5. Issei said, making sure to stay just a touch below her optimism. She needed to put more than a measly lap dance if she wanted to unlock more of his potential. Very good, Rias said, which was objectively true. Under the assumption that he was as weak as he was playing to be, being able to handle 5 boosts in just a day was an impressive improvement. Just not enough to meet Rias' needs. What's next, bucko? Issei asked as he walked towards the balcony, amused with the way her blush intensified with each step. Maybe some private training, he added, his tone of lecherous hope not entirely fake. Not today, Rias said rapidly. Now that you're strong enough to defend yourself, you're going to go for your first mission. Issei sent her a disappointing glare, which made Rias chuckle. Don't give me that look, Issei-kun. Without missions, you can't be promoted to the high-class devil, which will allow you to build your own harem. Harem. Issei said jubilantly. Too bad for her that when she talked about his harem, she thought she was talking about a far-off event, nor she knew that she was going to be a part of it. Irony at its finest. Okay, bucko, I'll go for the mission. With that, Rias gave him 3 ornate scrolls, one for each mission, followed by a quick explanation. Understood, bucko, Issei continued after listening to his orders. And is there a reward if I complete the missions? He started, only to correct himself. Sorry, remedial training. Only if you complete all 3 successfully, she answered. Alright, Issei said before stepping onto the teleportation circle, followed by a flash of red that carried him to his first destination. He could also feel another magical presence teleporting with him. Rias had sent her familiar to observe him, which was a sensible thing to do with the fallen angels around. The first 2 missions, he completed in less than an hour. They were even more boring than he had expected. 1. He helped an old lady to find her cat, while he helped a nerdy boy to defeat a particularly hard level in a computer game, each with a pitiful amount of conceptual energy in exchange, not enough to help even if he had been as weak as he had been acting. But when he teleported to his 3rd destination, he was met with the promise of things getting interesting. He was in front of a small house with a garden, which looked completely ordinary. A thick smell of blood hit his nose, one that was laced with pain. The easiest thing would be to alert Rias through her familiar, but that would mean losing the opportunity to have fun. He wasn't going to miss the opportunity to blow some steam. With that in mind, he knocked on the door, which moved the moment he touched, cracking eerily. In front of him he could see a bloodied footprint, but nothing else. He snorted in amusement. Someone had done their best to make it look like a scene from a horror movie, but had overdone in their enthusiasm. When he walked inside, the first thing he saw was his supposed contractor, hanging from the ceiling, bleeding profusely. He was still alive, because the contract was still active, but he had only seconds. In a moment of mercy, Issei gave him a vitality boost. The poor bastard had done nothing other than stepping into the path of the wrong person, which was a pitiful way to die. He could see 2 others in the room, cloaked in magical shadows, which paradoxically gave a feeling of holy magic, perfect for hiding from a low or mid-class devil. He examined them from the corner of his eye, not alerting them to the fact that they were being observed. One of them was a man of medium height, dressed in an exorcist's garb, holding a light-infused sword in his hand. But his excited tremble, and the expression of ecstasy on his face, which wouldn't be amiss on the face of a particularly amoral devil, suggested Issei that he was about to deal with an extremist. But his interest was grabbed by the other figure, a small, blonde girl dressed as a nun, whose face covered with tear tracks, and several bruises with handprints, suggesting particularly hard punches and slaps. Her eyes were wide as she examined Issei, her expression of mercy fit to a saint. Wasn't that interesting? Issei thought as he took a step forward. A beautiful nun that was willing to suffer to protect a devil and his summoner. The exorcist dashed forward silently, his blade ready, but he was aiming to Issei's leg, which, even with a holy sword, wasn't a hit that would kill Issei, telegraphing his intention to play with his prey. But what surprised him was the shout of the blonde nun. Devil-san, be careful. Issei was initially aiming to take a glancing hit, to play along with the exorcist's intent to torture a bit before turning the tables. But he decided to use that alert for an excuse to dodge. You shitty devil lover. The exorcist shouted in anger as his swing missed. No wonder church had kicked you out. Heretic. With that, he turned his back and lunged towards the nun, ignoring Issei for a moment, with a move that would have killed the girl, if Issei hadn't jumped in between, deflecting the holy sword with his sacred gear. The girl let out a panicked cry, which disappeared in the exorcist's angry bellow. And now a shitty devil is defending an excommunicated nun. What is this, a sitcom? The exorcist shouted. He swung his sword once more, this time much faster. Issei deflected it once more, but this time, receiving a deep wound. Ria's familiar was still watching, so he needed to keep his abilities believable. And giving the psycho-exorcist an impression of weakness would be amusing, especially when he pulled that particular rug under his feet. If you know any healing magic, help him, Issei said, gesturing the man that was hanging from the ceiling. He could keep him alive with his boosts, but more he used it, more suspicious it would be. Don't you dare, you shitty nun. The exorcist shouted, but the nun ignored that, dashing towards the victim bravely. Once again, Issei moved in between, moving even faster to match the speed of the exorcists, mimicking another boost, pushing the attacker back, receiving another wound in exchange. The mission held another surprise for Issei. When he ordered the nun to heal the victim, he was expecting an emergency spell that reduced the blood flow enough to stabilize him, not a flash of light that cured the victim's deadly wounds in a few seconds, not even leaving a scar. Such an interesting development made Issei change his plans. Initially, he was planning to play with the exorcist for a while, assuming it to be the height of the entertainment, but the prodigious healing ability the excommunicated nun showed changed his mind. So, when the exorcist attacked her once again, trying to bypass Issei, he let the exorcist to succeed, only to put himself between him and the girl at the last second, the sword impaling him through his stomach, which was only possible because he discreetly boosted the sword to make a good showing. Otherwise, even with his devil vulnerabilities, a low-grade holy sword wouldn't have broken through his natural defenses. A holy sword, boosted several times with Issei's own power, was nothing to scoff at. It actually hurt him quite a bit. In return, Issei put his gauntlet through Exorcist's heart, smirking darkly at the surprised expression on his face. Only at his last breath, the Exorcist realized that he was the one he had been being played all along. Then, he died, and Issei kicked him away, which also pulled the sword out. Devil-san, the nun shouted as she appeared next to him, pressing her hands on the wound, trying to stem the blood flow, and her hands started to glow in a soft light. Issei was about to shout in warning, not wanting to receive a burst of holy energy that would just make his wound worse, but he held himself back when he felt a warmth instead of the pain he was expecting, and his wound closed rapidly. Whatever the method she was using, she was also able to cure devils. Wasn't that fortunate? Then, a crimson circle appeared in the middle of the room, with Rias at the center, holding a ball of destructive energy, ready to swallow the room. First, previous ch6 of 16. Next, just chapter 7. Issei had to admit, he respected the courage the nun had displayed at the sudden appearance of Rias, her power of destruction crackling around her black and red, her expression of rage enough to even make Issei a little apprehensive. Without the knowledge that he was several times stronger than her even before his transformation, he would have been scared for his life. But the nun continued to heal him, and it wasn't that she wasn't aware of the danger she was in. Issei could feel her hands stiffening in fear, conducting her awareness about the impending possibility of death. But it was a credit to her courage that she didn't raise her head, not even to explain her situation, putting Issei's health above her own life. Something that was a definite probability with Rias blinded with wrath. He decided that it would be a pity to let Rias kill her in a fit. "Hi, bucko," Issei said with an exaggerated cheer, complete with a casual wave, one that reminded her that he was alive and for a certain interpretation of the word well. "Have you met my newest friend?" He felt the nun tremble once more when he uttered his last word, but this time, he received a weird sense of joy from her. Her reaction to the word friend was weird, but calming Rias was more important, so he shelved that train of thought. The last thing he needed was Rias to think that clearly holy glow around the nun's hands was hurting him, and decide to remove the threat by going to the source. He carefully maintained the smile on his face, despite the strain he was feeling in preventing his regeneration factor to cure him instantly. "What happened?" Rias said, her voice cracking like a whip. Intimidating, but much better than the alternative of disintegrating the whole room with her power. Though it would have been even better if it wasn't for the black ball of energy, still hovering above her hand. "Funny story," Issei said with a bloody smirk, one that put a slight smile on Ria's face despite the tightness of the situation. "I had a disagreement over the proper place of devils with that distinguished gentleman over there, which was rather heated." The calmness he was displaying wasn't on the line with the mask he had previously displayed, but luckily, Rias wasn't in a mood to catch such a small detail. And ultimately, he needed to shed his useless mask at some point, and next to a skewered exorcist after a surprise deathmatch was one of the best times to start doing so, where he could leverage double excuse of trauma and adrenaline. "And my new friend," he continued, then looked at the nun expectantly. "Asia," the girl murmured, blushing slightly as she raised her head, feeling confident that Issei wouldn't die from a second's break now that his wound stopped bleeding. "My new friend, Asia-chan, decided to help me by warning me against the ambush, saving me from a certain death," he explained. It was a shameless exaggeration, of course. Under no condition a 2-bit exorcist could be a threat against him without a legendary holy sword, and even then, the ambush needed to be perfect. Still, exaggerating the importance of the nun would make it easier to take her along. And Issei wanted her around. Not only she tried to save his life, which deserved a reward, but also she was the perfect mixture of bravery and innocence, toppled by a certain blonde cuteness that could be converted to sexiness with a bit of careful training, like a cute toy one could ravage in sexual ecstasy. Also, training a virgin nun to a sex toy would be fun in its own, the perfect way to celebrate his devilness. "I see," Rias said. She thought for a moment, deep in thought as she realized he had no idea of leaving her behind, obviously trying to come up with an excuse. Issei barely kept himself from rolling his eyes dismissively, waiting for Rias to recognize the opportunity. It took a few seconds for Rias' eyes to widen in shock, her gaze fixed on her hands above his wound. A nun, successfully healing a devil. Her mouth opened in excitement as the opportunity finally clicked in. We need to leave before reinforcements arrive. She turned to Asia. I'm sorry, Asia-san, but we can't bring you with us. My teleportation spell only works for devils. Issei rolled his eyes, for her obvious poor attempt to force Asia to a quick decision. Sooner or later, Asia would learn the full capabilities of Rias, which obviously included teleporting normal people, and at that point, would start to resent her for her lies. Asia's eyes widened in shock. I understand, she murmured as she tried to stand up, but her trembling legs prevented her from doing so. She might be innocent, but she had no illusion of what awaited her if stayed behind. Still, no whisper of mercy left her mouth, silently accepting her death. That acceptance shocked Rias as well, who had been clearly expecting Asia to demand her help, which would allow Rias to breach the possibility of resurrecting her as a devil. Normally, it wouldn't be a problem. She would just fake sudden mercy, and offer the position as a devil herself. Unlucky for her, Issei was ready to steal his wind, along with the ultimate loyalty of Asia. Don't worry, Asia-chan. I won't leave you alone, I'll protect you. He didn't know which was more amusing, Asia's worshipful expression, or Rias' exasperated one. But Issei-kun, Rias started, frustrated by his sudden show of independence, but Issei glared at her, acting like he actually thought that he was going to let Asia to die. Rias flinched as she came to the conclusion that her poorly thought-out plan risked Issei's loyalty as well. She sighed resignedly, accepting the failure of the original track. The only way I could bring her with us is if she agreed to be resurrected as a devil. Me, a devil? Asia said in shock, but Issei was happy to note that there was no disgust or revulsion in her tone, just shock, similar to the shock of a friendless boy, suddenly being picked first to a game. Come on, Asia-chan, accept, Issei said even as he squeezed her hand gently. That way, we can hang together. We can go eat out, and we can even go to an amusement park. Then, he continued with a more serious voice. And even if you don't accept, I'll stay here, defending you to my last breath. That put an alarmed expression on Ria's face, who wasn't willing to exchange the wielder of the boosted gear for a healer, no matter how good or versatile that healer was, but she was smart enough to realize that interjecting wouldn't be helpful at that point. For a moment, Asia stood still, with an expression of intense concentration on her face, realizing the enormity of the decision she was facing. Issei knew that, even with the short time they spent together, his declaration to defend her even if she didn't become a devil actually made her likelier to accept Ria's offer. She was a kind girl, one that would sacrifice herself to an unholy life rather than let him sacrifice himself. Issei-kun, she asked with a trembling voice. Are you really going to be my friend? We're already friends, Asia, Issei said, squeezing her hand, which put the cutest blush on her face. Rias-san, Asia said with a nod. You can resurrect me a devil. Rias let out a relaxed breath, her stress evaporating, realizing that she had just gained another valuable peerage member rather than losing the most important one she had. She summoned her set and pulled out a bishop piece. Lay on the floor, she commanded. Asia turned to Issei, who nodded in approval. The actual resurrection was quite anticlimactic. Rias put the piece on Asia's chest, which was then absorbed into her body, which left her unchanged other than a sudden exhaustion, still conscious. It feels weird, but warm, Asia murmured sleepily. When the glow subsided, Issei lifted her in a bridal bold, which made her blush cutely. Rias looked at him, but he just smirked. A perverted reputation was definitely useful sometimes. Perfect, rise, my bishop, Rias said, looking exhausted herself. She hadn't fought, but the emotional roller coaster she had gone through in the last few minutes had taken its toll. With a wave of her hand, she created another circle of teleportation, and Issei stepped through after her, still carrying Asia. You better get some rest, Asia-chan, Rias said kindly, which, Issei noted, was profoundly genuine. After all, while Rias could be selfish, but it was more of a combination of her entitled upbringing and the looming shadow of her upcoming marriage. Let's arrange a guest room for you for now. We can arrange something more permanent tomorrow. I don't think I can stay alone, she murmured in a sudden burst of courage, despite a blush thick enough to drown in. Can I stay with, she tried to say, But words failed her halfway. She took a deep breath, and repeated. Can I stay with you, Issei-kun, she said, this time managing to complete her sentence. Issei looked at Rias for her to agree first, trying to sell the impression that he still followed her orders, that his earlier display of disobedience was an anomaly. He expected her to look concerned, but she just nodded happily, indicating that she had missed the danger of having a peerage member more loyal to another member than her king. Another big mistake in her part, one that Issei had no problems in exploiting. Of course you can, Asia-chan, he said. Rias moved away, trusting Issei to handle the rest. She probably also hoped that with her obvious hero worship and his perversion, Asia would be willing to take Rias' role to train him in the special way he needed. Issei said nothing as he walked to his room, still carrying Asia with a bridle hold. When they arrived at his bed, she was already asleep, with her arms around his neck too right to unravel. He didn't bother to unwrap them as well, treating her like a particularly enthusiastic teddy bear. Tonight, she deserved her rest. Tomorrow, Issei was going to teach her how to have fun. The next day, Issei had woken up with a murmur from Asia, followed by a tightening of her arms around his torso. It's not a dream, she stammered in a desperate whisper, like a lost traveler in the desert, afraid of the pond in front of her might disappear at any moment. It's real. Good morning, Asia-chan, did you sleep well? He said with a smirk on her face. Yes, she murmured for a moment before the realization about their extreme closeness finally clicked. Issei-san, she exclaimed as she jumped back in panic, sliding out the covers, her shyness taking control. You are rather cheerful, he said with a smirk before letting a serious expression to take its place. So, how do you feel? Confused, and a little exhausted, she murmured, still shy. Both are completely understandable. Exhaustion is linked to your new life as a devil. Sunlight saps a part of your power, but the effect will affect you less as you get stronger. And confusion is inevitable. After all, your life changed last night. He walked up to her until he was close enough to grab her hand, squeezing gently to share friendship. But don't worry, I'll be there with you, he added, fully aware that in her fragile state, just a touch of kindness was all that was needed to create a loyal follower, nothing else necessary. And if he were, to be honest, he pitied her a bit as well, and wanted to give her a better life than she had experienced up until now. Luckily, it wasn't a difficult challenge. He prompted her to tell a bit about her circumstances, which unlocked her emotional gates. For the next hour, she went through her life in the church, her sacred gear, her status as the Holy Maiden, her abandonment after the discovery that her powers also worked on devils, therefore, indicating unholy roots, fallen angels taking her in, and the fateful night that the exorcist revealed the depth of their mercilessness. Issei hugged her tight as she cried against his chest, ignoring the temptation to push her into the deep end of the sexuality. After all, slowly corrupting an innocent nun would be much more amusing. Maybe he should encourage her to become a dominatrix. Even imagining her standing above a bound Rias, with a whip in hand, clad in red leather, but still stammering while she tried to give commands. Don't worry. These days are behind you now. You're going to have much more fun as time goes. Despite her suddenly intensifying crying, he could feel her smile widening as well. Maybe you should take a shower, you're still bloody from the last night, after all. Asia nodded, and Issei pointed at the shower, slightly disappointed that stepping inside with her was not an option. He wanted to taste her cutely sexy body, curvy despite her shortness, but not to the point that he was willing to destroy all the progress he had managed to gather. With a disappointed sigh, he left the room. It didn't take long for him to run across Rias. Issei-kun, good morning, Rias said with a forced cheerfulness, trying to act like it was an accident that she was at the corridor Issei was in, which would have been more believable if he hadn't been able to feel her familiar floating behind him, reporting her about his position and actions. It was with them during the night as well, probably to make sure Issei hadn't pushed Asia in her vulnerable state too much. Another point in Rias' benefit. Good morning, bucko. You look beautiful this morning, he said, for once letting a certain dragonic allure to slide his voice, putting a sudden blush on Rias' face. Issei spent the seconds Rias had used to gather herself to examine the way she dressed. Since it was the weekend, she was out of her uniform, replaced by an unappealing combo of sweatpants and a crop top. Or more accurately, it would have been unappealing if they weren't designed to someone a couple sizes smaller both on top and bottom, looking tight enough to be painted on, making her lack of bra extremely obvious. Due to its nature, he wasn't able to ascertain whether it was true for her panties as well, but even if she had, its insubstantialness was definitely not in doubt. Thanks, Issei, Rias murmured a few moments later, acutely aware that Issei had spent the break undressing her with his eyes, a task made much easier by the fact that he had first-hand knowledge about the treasures that lay underneath, but trying to act nonchalant. "How are you after the last night? I'm sure it hadn't been easy, taking a life." Issei shrugged, not really willing to play the wimpy depressive kid after the combat. "It's easier to handle than I would have guessed, maybe because that exorcist was obviously crazy. Still, the fact that I had to take a mortal wound just to keep up with a normal human is worrying. Maybe we should intensify our training. Do you think Akeno-chan is available for another session?" "Akeno is currently busy," Rias said with surprisingly thick rancor, her childish jealousy clear in her tone. Then, Issei said with a dismissive shrug as he grabbed Rias' wrist. He had already dragged her into one of the unused rooms when Rias realized that she had ignored a perfectly acceptable opportunity to excuse herself to leave the task to her queen instead. But as he closed the door, Rias had a blush on her face that was only partly about the loss of opportunity. After all, during their last time, she had experienced a rather obvious orgasm, and such a pleasure was doubtlessly hard for a devil to ignore. With that in mind, she had reacted rather slowly when Issei took an unexpected action, and pushed her against the wall, her chest pressing the wall. A gasp escaped as she was pinned against the wall, but rather than pushing him back, her gaze stayed stuck at his fist, which was pressing against the wall. Or more accurately, her eyes were stuck on his sacred gear, fascinated by its thick crimson glow, several times stronger than their last encounter, a corresponding metaphysical weight of his power pressing against hers. Not wanting to miss the opportunity, he pressed his shaft, unfortunately still in its confines, against her shapely bottom, his erection lodged in her generous booty. He was curious how far he was going to be able to push her in her distracted state. Author notes. And Asia joins the fray, while Rias is impressed by the sudden power-up her pawn is displaying. The question remains, how much she is willing to put on the table to push his power even further. But when facing against the domineering charm of the Red Dragon, will she be able to pull herself back before it was too late? Things are finally heating up in the Grimoires peerage. As usual, my original works are in Patreon, Dirk_Gray. First, previous ch7 of 16. Next, J. Chapter 8. Rias's fascination with the sudden power-up of his sacred gear was an opportunity that he had no intention of missing. Even after a couple of days, and despite its rather enjoyable benefits, wearing the mask of the idiot had started to take its toll on him, with his dragon instincts begging to be released. It was time to cut loose. And it wasn't like there was a huge risk doing that. He hadn't been expecting Rias to have an iron will, but the last 2 days showed him that playing her was almost trivial, her rather gullible nature further enhanced by the shadow of her upcoming marriage. With Issei finally giving her a chance of escape, she had little option to push back against it. With that in mind, he let his free hand land on her thigh with a sharp move, making her flinch, but when she kept her gaze on his sacred gear when he increased the radiance of power. Not one to miss such an opportunity, he let his hand climb upwards, a movement she barely reacted even when his fingers sank into the toned flesh of her lower cheeks, his shaft still resting comfortably in the middle. "You seem distracted, bucko," he whispered into her ear before leveraging the proximity to leave a string of gentle bites on her neck, each leaving her shuddering rather explosively, courtesy of additional boosting he applied on the pleasure created by each bite. The finer applications of the boost effect were much easier when applied on more direct effects like raw pleasure or pain, especially when the gauntlet was out its full state, giving him access to most of its powers. "I'm not distracted, Issei-kun," she managed to whisper several seconds later, but before she could even answer, her hips were already grinding against his crotch, unexpected passion taking control of her actions. "I'm just helping you to unlock your power, as any good king would. And what if I told you that you didn't need to degrade yourself like this, that I was okay with earning power in a slower, but a safer manner," he added, enjoying the way she suddenly stiffened. "Just as I suspected, you're pushing my development dangerously for your own benefit. How devious of you, Rias-chan," he whispered, keeping her pinned against the door even as she tried to turn to face him. "It's not like that, Issei-kun," she tried to explain, only to be interrupted by a spank on her bottom, a hard one that would have sting despite her enhanced resistance. She struggled to get away, but curiously, failing to push Issei away. With the current level of power Issei was applying, she would have no problems pushing him if she used a significant fraction of her strength, not to mention an impressive array of magic she could use to help. The fact that she limited herself despite the situation meant that she was trying to recover from her slip of the tongue in a more peaceful manner, without alienating him. which suited him just fine. He already had a payment in mind for her impudence. Don't lie to me, Rias-chan. I'm not an idiot. It's obvious that for some reason you're doing your best to speed up my development, and it's only expected that it comes with serious drawbacks. Otherwise, it would be a standard method. So, tell me, what's the big thing that made you risk my health without even having the courtesy to ask, he said. Funnily enough, it was actually correct. Like the dangerous technique she applied at their first night, his quickened development would have significant downsides in a few years in the future if he was actually as weak as he had been pretending to be. For the next several seconds, Rias was silent as she desperately tried to come up with an excuse that wouldn't burn the bridge between them. He used the opportunity to explore her body in a much rougher fashion, his hand slipping under her shirt first, then her bra to have direct access to her supple breasts, sinking into her flesh roughly. The pain jerked her awake off her thoughts, but she made no move to push him back, afraid to anger him. My family signed a betrothal agreement that would see me married before I could even finish the high school, she explained, a panicked urgency coloring her tone. Issei smirked in satisfaction but continued squeezing her glorious breasts harshly, his hips engaged once more, rubbing his shaft against her bottom, unfortunately, both of them still clothed. And you're hoping to use a rating game to force the dissolution of the agreement, Issei completed, an amused smirk on his face as Rias turned her head shocked. How do you know? She asked. Come on, Rias-chan. Only an idiot would miss the fact that devils are using rating games to solve literally any conflict they face. You guys have a rather simplistic worldview that unfairly favors the strong, you know. Rias didn't answer, still too shocked by the way her scheme, if that simplistic ploy even deserved to be called, that collapsed around her without any warning. Luckily for me, I'm going to be one of the strong ones. Then he let his expression turn into fake anger. If your approach hadn't already damaged my potential too much, of course. Issei-kun, I'm sure that, she tried to explain, but he cut her off once more, this time, using his gauntleted hand to spank her, the pain much sharper. No, Rias-chan. You can't escape the situation by quoting the probabilities, not when you didn't even give me a chance to accept willingly. Once again, Rias stayed silent for a while, a break he had used to trail circles on her bottom with his metal-covered finger, careful not to damage her skin, while his other hand continued its job of testing the suppleness of her breast. So, what now? She asked in a trembling tone, her fear palpable. Luckily for you, I'm a merciful guy, especially when such a sinful example of beauty is concerned, he said, her relaxation under his touch palpable. But, there should be still a punishment, otherwise, the lesson wouldn't stick. What punishment? She tried to ask, only to be silenced by another metallic spank. No questions, he said smugly. It's a punishment, not a bargain. You either accept, or I walk away, Issei added, pushing the envelope with a threat to a point he hadn't been planning even a few minutes ago. Apparently, his fake personality and the necessity to play the subservient servant was annoying him even more than he had first assumed. I choose punishment, Rias answered quickly, making him let out a relaxed breath. It would have been annoying if his plan had been destroyed by a momentary loss of control. Good girl, he said as he pulled back and walked towards the nearest chair, but he kept his hand in her shirt, meaning she was dragged along for the ride, only removing it when he arrived on a chair, in a careless manner that sent buttons flying around the room. Then, he forced her to lay on his knees, making her take a classical pose of spanking, complete with her skirt pushed up to reveal her bottom, insufficiently covered by her panties. The rules are simple, I'm going to spank you 10 times, he explained even as he caressed her bottom gently while she relaxed. But there are 3 rules. First, you're going to count every single one of them. Second, you're going to thank me appropriately when I'm finished. Third, if you speak any other word, or miss a count, I'm going to restart. He then spanked her bottom with his right hand, but only after letting his sacred gear to dispel. He didn't want to turn her delicious bottom to a bloody mess, after all. Is that clear? It's clear, Issei-kun, she gasped helplessly, but he was experienced enough to detect arousal in her tone. Not surprising, considering she was literally a spoiled princess that hadn't been seriously punished before, so receiving it in such a sexualized context worked wonders. The first spank landed on her bottom, a light one that could be easily classified as a warm-up. 1, she said obediently. The next 4 came rapidly, each stronger than the last, but she still counted every single one of them obediently despite her ass starting to glow with the watered-down color of her hair. Also, his fingers lingered on her bottom after every spank, once again without earning any errant comment. Issei decided to push the envelope, so, when the next spank landed, his touch lingered on her body even more while slipping to the dangerous regions. Say 7, she stammered in shock as his fingers traced her nether lips, but contrary to his expectations, she didn't break the rules. So, during the next collusion, he hooked his fingers to her panties, ripping them off without a warning, finally managing to break through her tattered control. Issei-kun! She exclaimed as she tried to stand up, but he was ready for it. His free hand slid into her hair, pinning her in place roughly, this time, making sure that she required a significant portion of her power to free herself. She didn't even come close to applying it. Somebody forgot the rules, Issei said gleefully as another spank landed on her bottom, even harder, and her bottom was even bereft of the protection that was provided by her panties. The result echoed in the room. Rias turned to face him, her intention to argue clear on her face, but she wasn't ready to meet with the domineering face of a dragon, one that would never allow even the slightest disrespect. She probably didn't even realize the reason for her sudden loss of will as she took her earlier position, her naked ass free for Issei's attention. 5, she called a moment later, after obediently recounting 5 stiff blows that Issei landed on her bottom in rapid succession. 5 beats that turned her bottom into a bruised mess that somehow looked even more delicious. 5 beats that completely destroyed Rias' preconceptions about him. At least, that was what he assumed, as unfortunately, mind reading wasn't one of his abilities. He wished it was, as it would be fun to have real-time commentary while she was punished by her pawn, the same pawn she had taken in the expectations of having an obedient tool. When the 6th blow connected, Issei didn't pull his hand away immediately. Instead, he gently caressed her nether lips, enjoying their wet state. A tremor went through her body with shock, but she still obediently accepted as he traced a path over her most sensitive spot. At the 7th blow, he was lingering over the entrance, occasionally slipping just a bit in without earning the slightest complaint. Issei was officially impressed, not enough to actually have mercy on her, of course. So, the 9th exploded her skin like a clap of thunder, one that actually brought tears to her face despite her magical endurance. And this time, his fingers parked at her entrance, his thumb skillfully sliding towards her knob, circling around it gently. Once again, she obediently stayed silent, so Issei slipped his fingers inside her, in a sudden rapidness that caught her by surprise. And before she could say anything, he rapidly boosted her pleasure twice, and even if she wanted to say anything, her moans didn't allow. It didn't take long for her to climax under his relentless assault, shivering and trembling on his lap. He spanked her once more, this time softer in a rare feeling of mercy. 10, she murmured dreamily, but made no attempt to stand up. Curious, he spanked her once more. 11, she continued, making another hungry smile to blossom on his face. If she was too distracted to stop, he wasn't above abusing the golden opportunity it created. Issei decided to stop once they reached 30, with 2 more breaks where Rias recovered from her unexpected orgasms. He pulled her until she was sitting on his lap, a combined mess of crying and trembling, but still sexy despite that. He hugged her gently, and she wrapped her hands around his chest in response. I'm sorry, Issei-kun, she slurred, acting like she was drunk. And maybe she was, as devils were much more linked to their primal sensations, and it was likely the first time Rias had experienced such a confusing assault of pleasure and pain. I didn't want to let you die, but I can't afford your rejection. I can't spend my life as a slave to that idiot. Please forgive me, she continued, words spilling her mouth unintentionally. He doubted whether she would be able to remember all of them, but enough should stick, making his life even easier. I understand, Rias-chan, he said as he gently clasped her chin and forced her to raise her head, slowly kissing her cheeks until he got rid of all of her tears, which took a while as she continued to cry. She giggled at his sudden gentleness, and he chose that moment to seal her lips with a soft, lingering kiss. You're forgiven, he said after pulling back, but this time, it was Rias who interrupted him with a searing kiss of her own. What followed was one of the most difficult moments of his life, going through Rias' searing kiss while her naked lips rubbed against his crotch, his pants barely able to keep his own erection at bay as her juices seeped into the fabric. It was a pity that he couldn't use the opportunity to its full potential. Not when taking her virginity would trigger several unfortunate clauses in her betrothal agreement, which would have complicated their situation even further. Of course, while he couldn't fully benefit from the situation, it didn't mean that he was going to let the situation go without some compensation. Ripping off her shirt was trivial for his strength, and her bra ended up suffering a similar treatment, leaving her skirt as the only piece of clothing on her body, which was pretty ineffective as a cover as it gathered around her waist. Only when she shuddered helplessly on his lap once more, he gently pushed her away. "Issei-kun?" she asked in a trembling tone, too far gone to form a coherent sentence. "Look what you have done," Issei answered as he pulled out his shaft, hard and ready. "It's your responsibility to fix," he added as he pushed Rias back, and a small tap behind her knees later, she collapsed on the floor, her kneecaps loudly hitting the floor, extracting a surprised gasp. The mixture of pain and shock worked wonders to dispel the confusing haze she was under. A cold realization hit her face as she tried to process the indignity she had went through, her mouth slackened with shock as the realization hit. Unfortunately for her, Issei had no intention to allow her to act on that realization. He grabbed the back of her head with one hand while used the other to free his shaft, and Rias found herself impaled with his shaft. Rias' shock only intensified at the moment, and Issei used the moment to pull her even deeper, until his shaft was deeply lodged in her throat. For a moment, he lamented that he wasn't recording the moment, as the outrage on Rias' face one of the most delicious views with his girth forcing her lips wide while she tried to breathe. Then, a desperate resignation took its place, thanks to the earlier loss of control and revealed secrets, sapping her will to push back. He knew that after this, Rias would avoid him for a few days at least, so he decided to enjoy the moment to the max. He used one hand to push her even deeper on his shaft, invading her throat completely. He stabbed sharp enough to make her gasp and wheeze despite her supernatural constitution. His other hand slid down until his fingers met with her naked tits, mauling them in an equivalent lack of restraint. Soon, her hands found his thighs, tapping desperately as she tried to breathe, but Issei ignored these attempts, just as he ignored her ineffectual attempts to push herself away using his thigh as leverage. Since she was too distracted to use her strength effectively, he hadn't even used his real strength to keep her in place. Already primed due to earlier punishment game, it didn't take more than a few minutes for Issei to reach the edge. He pulled out at the last second, covering Rias' ragged face and bruised breasts with his seed, who was trying to decide between shame and outrage, her expression cycling rapidly. Before she could decide on one, however, Issei cut in. "Thanks, bucko," he said with mock earnestness. "I accept your apology. Will I see you at dinner?" Reminding her about the guilt and fear that forced her to the situation in the first place proved to be the last touch. Too overwhelmed with the situation, she just grabbed the ripped remains of her shirt for coverage. "Maybe, but I need to go," she murmured rapidly as she jumped to her feet, turning towards the door at the same time. Issei didn't miss the opportunity and landed a playful slap on her hips, and she dashed away like a startled mare. "See you around, bucko," Issei said with a smirk, his mind already on how to quicken his plan to dominate the rest of the peerage. Author notes. Rias finally gets her first clue that her pawn might not be as stupid and innocent as she had assumed, a humiliating lesson to be learned. The question, how well Rias will be able to stomach it, how much more she was willing to suffer to guarantee her freedom, and when she would notice that she had already signed herself into servitude. I hope everyone enjoyed the change of pace. Things are finally going to quicken. Also, I have a question about the sequence of characters. The girls on the peerage, in particular, Rias, Akeno, and Asia will be the current focus, but for the next girl, I have two options. Sona, or Graphia. Which one you guys and gals would prefer? As usual, my original works are in Patreon, Dirk_Gray. First, previous ch8 of 16 next chapter 9 Issei wasn't surprised when Rias avoided him for the rest of the day. After all, the sudden reversal she had experienced would be difficult to process for anyone, and even the best devils weren't famous for their adaptability. And as a spoiled princess who had been protected for all her life, Rias could be hardly qualified for that part. Since spending the rest of the day with Rias wasn't an option, Issei spent most of his day on a date with Asia where he had shown her around the town while also subtly probing her about her commitment to religion, though he had put a few hours for training as well. Not the real variety, unfortunately, as it wasn't feasible with all the observers, the fake one, but with a significantly increased aptitude for his sacred gear in a visible location, trying to prove Rias that her humiliating punishment was actually quite useful. Rias wasn't there to observe him, neither in person nor through a hidden familiar. A proof of her distraction, but Issei hadn't felt dismayed, because Akeno was there, watching him with an excited expression on her face from the corner she thought herself to be hidden, no doubt imagining about a particularly humiliating session of domination. But she took action, and since Issei had to act like he was unaware of her presence, he went to his room, writing off the night as a boring bust. Then, he heard a knock on the door. "Come in," he called with an excited smile when he felt a familiar presence on the other side of the door. His visitor followed his request and slowly opened the door, revealing it was Asia on the other side, dressed in a long, extremely conservative sleeping gown that started tight from her neck, and went down to her ankles. No doubt a special request from her, as he doubted Rias had such a boring thing in storage. For all of her faults, she knew how to present her assets, and assets of her peerage. A pity, Issei decided even as Asia walked in, closing the door behind her. As while Asia was on the small side, she still had a body too beautiful to be hidden in such a manner. "How can I help you, Asia-chan?" Issei said with a smirk, not bothering to hide the edge, as Asia was too innocent to pick the message up before it was too late. "Do you mind if I stayed here for a while?" Asia murmured even as she wrung her hands, displaying her nervousness. "Did you have a nightmare?" Issei asked, and received a trembling nod in return, one that reminded him of a scared songbird. It was a pity that the little songbird was unaware that the cave she tried to hide housed a dragon. "And you want to stay here until you feel less scared, so you can go back to your room?" Asia nodded again. "Would you like to stay with me instead like we did last night?" he asked. "Can I?" she asked excitedly before her rationality could reassert itself, along with a frown. "But I can't, it would be a sin." "God," she tried to continue, only to stop by a wince as the holy name itself gave her pain. "Come on, Asia, there's no sin in helping a struggling friend," Issei said, fully aware that it was wrong. "You have just gone through several traumatic events one after another, and a little comfort from a friend is definitely deserved." She nodded, then ducked her head to hide the rapid blush that was spreading to her face, one that Issei let to possess her face, no doubt due to her mind suddenly running amok due to possibilities. He wasn't surprised, not after he had spent their date subtly flirting with her to put the idea in mind. He wanted his loyal healer, and he wanted to tame her as soon as possible. He let out a subtle chuckle as he lifted the cover, and Asia slid underneath it, though she stayed a good distance away from him, possibly due to the size of the bed. Something Issei didn't want to allow. "Don't be shy," Issei said as he put his arm around her waist, and pulled her closer with a chuckle. "That's too close," she said after a shocked gasp as she tried to wiggle out of his hug, but it lasted suspiciously short. "Come on, Asia, don't worry too much, or you'll have wrinkles on your pretty face," he said, making Asia blush even more. "But it's sinful," she murmured in response, but her lack of conviction was obvious from the way she pressed her body against Issei's, her crush and emotional worship stronger than the tatters of the emotional conditioning of the life she spent in church. He suspected her conversion to a devil was playing a role as well, making her more receptive to conceptual sins, not that he complained. He decided to face her complaints directly. "Come on Asia, you're a devil now, so worrying about sinning is pointless." But, she tried to answer, only to Issei to cut her off. "No buts. The church has no right to push their twisted sense of morality to you, especially not after they kicked you just because you followed their tenets and showed mercy. Why should you be obligated to follow their orders while they ignore their basic responsibilities? Isn't it bad to sin?" Asia questioned in a trembling voice, her conviction wavering already. "Not all so-called sins are equal," Issei explained. "Yes, it's bad to hurt others, but what about simple things that hurt no one? They were ridiculous enough to forbid masturbation, despite the fact that it doesn't hurt anybody. Such a ridiculous thing," he continued, the anger in his tone not exactly faked. He had always found the ban on masturbation very offensive, to the point he would act against the church in an offensive manner once he was strong enough. "Masturbation?" Asia exclaimed panically, her sensibilities unable to handle the word itself. "Exactly. It's both enjoyable and harmless, so why should anyone stop themselves from doing it?" Issei explained heatedly before noticing the expression on her face. He suddenly felt suspicious that Asia was even purer than he had expected. "You have masturbated before, right?" he asked, only to receive a subtle shook of the head. Surprised, he kept his gaze on her until she whispered one trembling word. "No." "That's a travesty," he said with a chuckle, though he made sure to finish it with a soft breath, targeting Asia's neck, which made her wiggle in confusion while her body triggered in anticipation. "We should fix it right now," he said even as he put his hand on her leg, above her nightgown not to scare her off, and slowly dragged upward. "Issei-kun. What are you doing?" she exclaimed in panic, her voice loud enough to make Issei glad that he had put silencing charm. With their familiars absent, Rias and Akeno had no idea what was going on in his room, which allowed him to act much more decisively while seducing her. "I'm helping you, as any good friend would," he said, shamelessly abusing Asia's sense of gratitude towards him. And as a devil, she had to learn it one way or another, and the current manner was one of the best to enable it. But, she tried to say, only to cut herself short when she met with Issei's best charming smile, subtly enhanced by his magical presence. Despite their violent reputation, dragons could be really charming when they wanted to. "Trust me, and close your eyes," Issei whispered into her ear. Asia trembled with an emotion other than fear. After all, while she might have been inexperienced, her body was mature enough to trigger her instincts, no doubt helped by her devil nature. With her eyes closed, Issei gently caressed her body, focusing on her thighs and stomach, occasionally bringing his fingers to her neck, enjoying her soft skin. He avoided overtly sexual points at first, giving her time to get used to his touch. It wasn't a surprise that a gasp escaped her mouth soon after, followed by her eyes popping in shock. "Don't worry, it's natural," Issei whispered softly while the dance of his fingers continued, and she closed her eyes once more, unable to resist his gaze. Soon, another gasp left her mouth, followed by a barely suppressed moan, but neither was shocking enough to make her open her eyes. He was patient in his treatment. After all, unlike Rias, Asia hadn't done anything to earn his annoyance, therefore deserving of his kindness. Though, the cute little moan when his hands drifted on her chest was a temptation hard to resist. But thanks to his playing with Rias earlier, he was not tempted to ruin his plan by hurrying. Instead, he drew a gentle, patient spiral until he reached her nipples, even though the effect wasn't as tempting with her thick bra on the way. Enough patience, he decided as he put his fingers on her thigh once more, just above her knee. But this time, his fingers were on her naked skin rather than touching over the thick texture of her dress. And just like that, Asia's eyes popped open once more, her mouth open to deliver her complaints. Issei was ready for it. While he was tempted to catch her lips in a searing kiss, that would ruin his slow play. Instead, he pressed his lips on her neck, her lack of familiarity with pleasure enough to trigger a shocked moan while he gently sucked her skin. And her distraction allowed his fingers to slowly climb up her thighs, her supple skin folding under his touch. Then, his fingers were lingering over her most sensitive spot, her panties as the only protection. Issei wished a camera to be there to record, as the expression of utter shock on her face while she faced the rush of unfamiliar pleasure was delicious. "You understand my point about pleasure, right?" Issei whispered into her ear even as he gently circled her knob repeatedly, taking it slowly not to destroy her under the rush of pleasure. "It's too much," she gasped. "I didn't know such pleasure was possible." "It's just a beginning, Asia. It's nothing compared to what's about to come," he explained even as his fingers slipped underneath her panties, touching her naked skin. There, she managed to surprise him, as the unfamiliar sensation of his naked touch, along with her anticipation, was enough to trigger her orgasm, leaving her moaning and shuddering. Issei smirked in amusement while he whispered sweet nothings to her ear, stopping his intimate massage for the moment. He knew that Asia was not in a point to resist his touch that soon after her first orgasm, but that didn't mean he was going to stay idle. With a flex of his mana, he disintegrated her bra and panties, as they were too boring to play. Then, he took a deep breath and cast the same spell, this time targeting her nightie, but in a much more difficult manner, as he was aiming to thin her nightie rather than destroy completely. A display of precision that would have been impossible before his conversion. "How was it?" he whispered, once again his lips caressing her ear. "It was unbelievable," Asia murmured, still trying to catch her breath. "I could never imagine such pleasure was possible." "Not bad for the first round, right?" Issei said even as he unbuttoned her shirt, revealing her creamy skin to his attention, her areolas peeking from the corner. "First round." Asia gasped, but the rest of her words disappeared in another moan when he grabbed her nipple and squeezed gently, making her face yet another unfamiliar sensation, while his other hand started caressing her lower lips once more, this time with a much more determined and quick manner. Asia's moans rose once again under his determined assault while his fingers probed her entrance occasionally, but not pushing forward. Issei didn't say anything, and Asia couldn't say anything, so, the rest of the moments passed in a unique silence if one discounted Issei's occasional erotic whisper, and Asia's unbounded moans. Issei only stopped after Asia climaxes neared double digits, her virgin and innocent body helpless under the grasp of the dragon. She was especially exhausted when he stopped giving her enough time to breathe between orgasms, which made her exhaustion even stronger. Ultimately, Issei decided to let her rest a couple of hours later. Do you still think the church was justified in forbidding masturbation, Asia-chan? Issei whispered as he spooned the not-so-innocent blonde, his heat wrapping around her like an extra blanket. Damn the church, she murmured, barely coherent as she tried to stay awake, only to fail badly against her exhaustion. She fell asleep, unable to hear Issei's chuckles. Issei followed her soon after. In the morning, Issei felt Akino's presence well before she arrived at his door, but hadn't felt important enough to react. If it had been before he disciplined Rias, he might have tried to hide Asia, but she was sufficiently distracted by the excessive punishment she received, and the fact that her pawn was actually aware of her plan. That left Akino as the only person to suppress before he could start acting freely in the peerage. And since he was supposed to be in the training area with Akino in a few minutes, there was no point hiding his other achievements. His position was too assured for it to be a risk. Of course, that didn't prevent Akino from letting out a shocked gasp when she opened the door, nor it prevented a newly awakened Asia to yelp in panic before hiding under the blanket like a cute little rabbit. Well, she murmured, trying to hide her shock. What a surprise. Issei used the moment given by Akino's shock to devour her vision. Since it was the weekend, she chose to dress in something other than her school uniform, choosing to dress in the garb of a shrine maiden. A modified one, of course, with a shorter skirt and a deep cleavage, displaying Akino's assets to a maximum effect while still paying lip service to her traditional behavior. Asia had trouble sleeping, so she decided to ask for my help, Issei explained, more to make Asia relax rather than convince Akino, as the smell in the room was rather distinctive, especially a devil's enhanced senses. But Akino's shock soon melted, leaving its place to amusement. A sign that Rias hadn't shared what happened with Akino, as Akino was smart enough to understand the implications of such rapid seduction domination chain. Is that so? Akino said with a smirk as she took a step forward, but Issei gestured her to stop. Akino-chan. Why don't you go ahead in the training area and start the preparations? I'll be there shortly, he said. Akino opened her mouth, but before she could say anything, Issei hit her with the concentrated pressure of his dragonic soul. And just like that, another gasp escaped her mouth, her eyes wide, her arms raised, ready to summon a shield. A frustrated expression replaced her panic when she met with Issei's smirk, soon turning into anger. The reason was simple. Akino prided herself in her calm and her ability to control the situation, both destroyed under his dragonic aura. Maybe I will, Issei-kun. Akino answered in a dark tone that would have sent shivers to the spine of a lesser man. I will go ahead and prepare for the training field. Don't be rude and keep an innocent maiden wait too long. Okay, she said, and Issei just snorted. A devil who fashioned herself as a dominatrix with a lightning proficiency was difficult to refer to as innocent. Is she gone? Asia murmured when the door slammed, her head still underneath the blanket. Yes, she's gone, Issei said, but Asia still stayed underneath the blanket, so he pulled it off, revealing Asia's visage, still looking rough after last night's activities. Issei-kun, she exclaimed as her shyness exerted itself once more, especially when she noticed the absence of her bra and panties, and the fact that her nightie had turned transparent. No need to feel shy, he said even as he hugged her body once more, and despite her shyness, Asia melted against his touch. I need to go for my training session, he said, only for a complicated expression to appear on Asia's face, confusion and desire battling for dominance against her shyness. But first, let me show you another little trick, he added, and before Asia could answer, he ripped off her nightie with one pull. While Asia was busy processing her shock, Issei had already buried his head between her legs, his tongue out, brushing her nether lips. Her shocked cry was soon replaced by the cries of pleasure, her body too hungry for pleasure after the last night's treatment. Do you want me to continue? Issei asked after a couple of moments, and she just nodded. I want an answer, Issei repeated. For a moment, she was stunned, overwhelmed by the requirement of mentioning her desires explicitly. She gazed at him, hoping to find a reprieve, but only found an encouraging smile, as he knew that anything more would only destroy his progress. Issei-kun, please, continue. Continue what? He countered even as he kept his lips close enough that his hot breath tickled her softness. Lick me. Down there, she managed to murmur, though managed to blush deeply enough to make her faint if she had been still a human. Issei could have forced her to be more explicit, but decided that was enough victory for the day, and dived back to her wetness, accompanied by her enthusiastic cries. As her orgasm rapidly closed in, She even surprised him by grabbing his head roughly while trying to contain her orgasm, giving the first sign that under all that religious oppression lay a sexy minx begging to be let out. And Issei was more than enthusiastic about doing that, one step at a time. Author notes. And Asia takes first steps into the lands of corruption. On more important news, due to ongoing crisis, my status employment had been changed from full-time to part-time. However, for you guys and gals, it's quite a good development, because until I go back to full employment status, I have quite a bit extra time, meaning I'll be updating more often, both here and on my Patreon page. As usual, my original works are in Patreon, Ddraig_Gray. First, previous ch9 of 16. Next, chapter 10. Issei couldn't help but feel a bit of a loss as he left his room, leaving Asia alone, collapsed on the bed, reeling from the effects of his skillful tongue, naked as the day she was born. It might be her sense of abandonment forcing her to lean on the first one that supported her, or it might be the devil transformation that might be transforming her mentality. Issei was glad for it in any case. The first few days of his life as a devil had gone better than he expected. Rias, his supposed king, was much easier to manipulate than he had assumed, making his attempts of subverting her rule fun. He still had to be careful, of course, as Rias was hardly the most dangerous gremmery. No, that honor went to his brother who had abandoned his family name to take the title of Lucifer, famous as the strongest devil. As much as Issei wanted to test himself against him, he knew it was too early for something like that. Luckily, there were a lot of things for him to dally while he got stronger, 2 of them he had already acquainted in detail. And with Rias and Asia have already taken the first real steps under his dominion, it was time for Akeno to join the fray. He needed to visit the training arena where Akeno was waiting for him, but he decided to take a small detour to the armory. There, he picked a couple of armor pieces, a stylish chainmail, and an imposing gauntlet to his left hand that wouldn't look too bad with his boosted gear. It was more about the style and to convey the seriousness of the situation to Akeno rather than their protection value, as his skin was much harder than any armor that they had laying around. After completing his new gear, he was at the underground training area underneath the club. "You're late, Issei-kun," Akeno said in a tone that might have been mistaken for calm, if it wasn't for his enhanced dragonic senses catching her annoyance. Still, he was happy to hear that, as it would make it even more satisfying when he finally pushed her down to take her. The way she was dressed was even better than the promise of satisfaction. She was wearing a modified shrine maiden outfit that hugged her body perfectly, displaying every single curve she had without shame, with a cleavage deep enough to reveal the color of her bra, which was purple. Also, her outfit was short enough that her every movement carried to the risk of flashing him. Even better was the seductive expression on her face, enough to stir his desire, her hidden annoyance just enhancing it more. Her careful selection of attire was clearly had ulterior motives, once again trying to quicken the awakening of his devil powers through the sin of lust despite its potential to harm him if he had been as weak as he was playing to be. "Sorry, Akeno-chan," he said with an insincere tone, something Akeno caught easily if the sudden tightening of her smile was any indicator. "I had to help Asia-chan before leaving. It would have been rude to cut my help halfway. She needs to acclimate herself to the life of a devil." "Are you trying to make me jealous, Issei-kun?" Akeno countered, trying to sound teasing, but that was only paper thin, hiding the heat of her anger underneath. Issei had a feeling that it was more about him being late than actually anything about Asia. Still, he enjoyed the way Akeno displayed her cleavage as she teased him. "I don't know what you mean, Akeno-chan. I'm helping her just the way you and Bucko had helped me. Is it somehow unusual?" Issei answered with a smirk, letting his eyes drag over her body to remind her that she had been forced to serve as a common stripper at her king's request just to speed up the development of his devil powers, poking at her pride unashamedly. Akeno chose not to answer, instead of waving her hand, making a bunch of targets appear on her field of view. "Today we're going to work on your magic skills," she explained, her calm exterior trembling for a moment, unhappy with his reminders. "First we're going to work on materializing mana, then we're going to move on to target practice." Then, she smirked in a way that showed she might have certain ideas for the training. "However, just to make sure you're paying attention to the training, I'm going to give a small shock to you every time you miss a shot," she continued, lightning crackling between her fingers. "Really, Akeno-chan? Wouldn't it hurt?" Issei said, but this time, he wasn't bothering to maintain his idiot persona, aware that their little game was about to come to an end. Under the circumstances, it was better to keep Akeno focused on him rather than her keeping a calm mind and discussing things with Rias. He still needed some time before Rias' situation could be revealed to the rest of her peerage. Akeno giggled. It wasn't a cute, playful giggle. Instead, it was one that hinted that her reputation as the sadist queen wasn't an empty title. Maybe a bit, but I'm sure a strong man like you can handle without an issue, Issei-kun? Maybe I can, Issei answered. But that doesn't mean that I will, he added, but continued before she could cut in, unless there's something really interesting on the table, of course. Of course, Akeno answered with a smirk, amused at his presumption. From her gaze, Issei could read that she was already convinced of his failure. After all, he was just a new devil, far above the situation. What do you have in mind, Issei-kun? We should go for something simple. How about you lose a piece of clothing whenever I hit a target? Akeno frowned a bit at his offer, aware of his high likelihood of accuracy. After all, targets weren't exactly small. Then, her eyes grew as she subtly waved her hand in a way that she thought as hidden. With his magical perception, Issei could see that she had established a repelling field in front of each target, one that would deflect his spells, preventing them from hitting the target. Not a bad idea, Issei-kun, but a target is too big. How about we limit it to the bullseye? Only if I got to add another condition, Issei answered. Akeno nodded, and he continued. Anything that gets removed stays that way until the end of the training session, including the sparring. You want to spar with little poor naked Akeno-chan? Then, she answered with a mock despondence as she leaned forward and pushed her arms together, enhancing her cleavage further. What did I deserve to gain such a merciless student, trying to hurt his teacher in the first lesson? Don't worry, Akeno-chan. I'll make sure that you enjoy it, Issei said confidently with a wink, making Akeno even angrier. That it was better for him, angrier she was, the longer she would last. With one final nod, she launched a small tutorial on how to externalize his magical prowess, and she even taught him a small lightning attack. Issei nodded in hidden appreciation on her trick, as lightning was not only hard to control, making it a poor selection for target practice, but also it would have been affected by her lightning-natured repelling fields excessively, making it impossible for it to meet with the target. Too bad for her that Issei was already capable of magic. After around 5 minutes of training, Akeno decided to cut it short. That's enough theory, Issei-kun, Akeno said with a giggle. Why don't you try to conjure a ball of mana? Issei decided to struggle a bit at first, mostly to make her even more confident about the bed before he pulled the rug underneath her. The first ball of mana he conjured was a small, pitiful thing, barely able to stay alive under its own power. Come on, Issei-kun, try a bit. You know what they say about guys with small mana, she said mockingly. How about if you give me a little incentive like you did while trying to help me conjure my sacred gear, Issei said. Such a naughty boy. Akeno gasped excessively as she brought her arm on her lips, her other hand on her leg. What do you have in mind? Issei said nothing, just reached forward and grabbed her breast mercilessly, his fingers sinking into her flesh easily. Her eyes flashed in anger at his presumption, her hands sparkling with lightning, but she managed to hold herself back, still trying to play a role. Just as Akeno opened her mouth, ready to remove his hand, he let his magic free, and a crimson ball of energy, with occasional bolts of lightning dancing on the surface, appeared, floating above his palm, too dense to belong a novice. Under any other situation, such a display would have revealed his play as the human unaware of the supernatural, but luckily, boosted gear and the boost from his sin of lust was enough to explain the phenomenon. Even if Akeno felt suspicious, it wouldn't really matter in a few days. How about this one, Akeno-chan? He asked with a smirk even as he kept squeezing her breasts repeatedly. When her eyes got stuck on his proto-spell, he decided to use her distraction to a better benefit, and slipped his hand into her cleavage, mauling her tits over her bra, its thin fabric barely isolating her skin from his. Not bad, Issei-kun, Akeno answered, still fascinated by the way crimson lightning was dancing threateningly on its surface. Issei used the opportunity to push his luck more, and pulled her bra to the side, and started massaging her naked tit skillfully. Only after a gasp escaped her mouth Akeno realized the liberties he was taking. That's enough, Issei-kun, she said as she took a step back, giving him a glimpse of her naked breast before quickly fixing it. Let's see whether you'll be able to hit your target, she said quickly, occupied by her lapse of attention. Issei smirked at the way she was cheating, not allowing him to master the lightning spell before trying to hit the targets. He decided to play along, and cast his first spell badly, letting it fizzle out of existence halfway. Too bad, Issei-kun, Akeno said as she blasted him with a bolt of lightning. Ouch, careful, Issei said, making a show of being hurt. Akeno wasn't holding back much. The amount she had used would have left a new devil twitching on the floor. Come on, Issei-kun, Akeno said as she put her hand on his shoulder flirtatiously. You're the holder of the boosted gear, don't tell me you can't handle a weak bolt of lightning. Issei just smirked before casting the spell once more, this time reaching the target, but bounced to the side by Akeno's deflection field. Akeno hit him with another lightning bolt, several times stronger than the previous one. You're really pushing your luck, Akeno-chan, Issei said as he smiled at her darkly. If the previous one would have damaged a new devil, this one would have killed the said devil instantly. Surely not, Issei-kun, Akeno said with a fake smile, but he could see hints of suspicion underneath. His lack of reaction to her attack was simply too mild, especially considering he didn't have the boosted gear out. Luckily, it was just a groundless suspicion for the moment. Issei decided to give her a more immediate problem. He conjured the lightning once more, this time several times stronger than before, and sent it forward, creating a crater in the middle of the target. Bullseye, he said as he took a step to Akeno, and put his hand on her shrine maiden outfit. What are you doing, Issei-kun? Akeno murmured. Getting the fruits of my victory, Issei said. Akeno looked annoyed at his presumption, but she was under orders, so she had to swallow her dissatisfaction. Don't you want to watch me undress slowly, Issei-kun, she murmured playfully, but Issei could see that it was an attempt to maintain control. Nope, Issei answered as he tugged her outfit, ripping it violently, leaving her in her underwear. Such a naughty boy, Akeno giggled, trying to hide her discomfort, more due to her sudden loss of control than the fact that she was in her underwear. After all, it wasn't the first time she was revealing her delicious curves to his sight. Issei cast another spell, missing once again. You need to work on your aim, Akeno said as she raised her hand, her smile displaying her full sadism without bothering to hide. Before she could blast, Issei conjured his boosted gear, not because he needed its assistance to resist her overpowered attack, but to have an excuse about his lack of wounds. Akeno giggled as she blasted him with an extended lightning bolt, the intensity increasing in each second. It was far from her full power, but still, considering she was already a high-class devil, it didn't mean a lot. Issei was glad to have his power, because Akeno was as crazy as she was sexy. Dealing with her without his powers would have been a nightmare. When she finally stopped, she saw his untouched visage. How? She murmured, shocked. Issei just waved his gauntleted hand in response. That's cheating, she murmured. Issei just smirked before conjuring another lightning spell, once again hitting his target. This time, before he could take a step to her, she quickly removed one of her sandals. A piece of clothing, just as promised, she said, her smile smug. Issei let her enjoy her momentarily victory before casting another spell, destroying yet another target. Akeno removed her other sandal. With a smirk, Issei hit 2 targets in a row. It's easier than I would have assumed, he said smugly as he closed in the distance once more, one hand on her panties, the other on her bra, both falling on the floor in pieces after he pulled them violently, revealing her naked visage for his sight. Do you want to continue with the target practice, Akeno-chan? Issei said smugly as he examined her body without shame, his bulge visible. Though, we might need to strike a new bargain considering your state of dress.
No, we can move to spar, Akeno said, not bothering to hide her visage as she walked toward the center of the stage, her beautiful assets jiggling with each angry step. We need to make sure that you can hold yourself in a fight.
Of course, Issei said as he walked closer, the boosted gear still prominently displayed on his arm. Akeno looked at it with dissatisfaction, but not worry, clearly assuming that her queen amplifications would be sufficient to dominate him. It was a dangerous assumption. Are you sure you want to do this? Akeno said mockingly, more to goad him to act than any concern about his well-being. There's no shame in admitting that you're weaker than a poor little girl like me, she added, trying to goad his pride, and through the way she jiggled her tits, lust as well, making sure he wouldn't surrender easily. Nope. I'm ready to go, Issei said, taking a step forward and raised his arm. But how about we make it a bit more interesting, he added. I'm insulted that you don't find a spar with this poor girl interesting enough, Akeno said with a giggle as she pointed at her naked body, her every curve sculpted to perfection to give a sense of feminine allure, begging Issei to push forward and take her down. You're beautiful, Akeno-chan, Issei said. But I'm thinking that stopping after pinning you on the floor, helpless, would have been such a pity. So, I'm thinking that we continue no matter what until someone admits defeat. He smirked as he let his eyes focus on the treasure between her legs. No matter what, he repeated. Oh, ambitious. Akeno laughed derisively, fully expecting to win and insulted by him thinking that he had a chance of victory. But if we're going to do that, I want something better. The winner wins one night, from dawn till dusk, with no restriction on the requests. If you were willing to be my plaything for a full evening, who was I to disagree? Issei countered, gesturing her to start. Author notes. Akeno learns that a battle under misinformation might be a dangerous affair. Sorry about that, but it had been a while since I had last updated this little gem. I finally come around to update this story, which is quite fun to write. Hopefully, I will be updating this more often. As usual, my original works are in Patreon, Ddraig_Gray. First, previous ch10 of 16.